Hey everyone! Tonight we dim the lights and settle in for a journey back to a time of ruffs and rapiers. A world where a misplaced glance could mean a fight to the death. You're standing on cobbled streets, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and something less pleasant, perhaps the refuse of 1,000 unwashed bodies. You hear the distant clatter of hooves, the raucous laughter from a tavern, and somewhere, a whispered challenge that seals a man's fate. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of Elizabethan England, not to admire the poetry or the plays, but to unearth a peculiar, almost unbelievable ritual why courtier, those fashionable, often dangerous gentlemen, might have chugged a glass of milk right before they faced down an opponent in a duel. It sounds utterly absurd, doesn't it? Like something out of a Monty Python sketch, only with real swords and genuinely fatal consequences. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, at least not metaphorically speaking, as we plunge into a world where honor was everything and life was cheap. So wait, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if you like what you hear, remember to like and follow the channel to continue waiting for the next exciting parts. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're nestled within the shimmering, yet deeply treacherous Elizabethan court. It's a place where silk and velvet conceal sharp ambitions and even sharper blades. Imagine the endless corridors of Whitehall Palace, whispering with secrets, where every smile hides a potential trap and every casual remark could be a veiled insult. Queen Elizabeth Erskne's court was not just a seat of government. It was a vibrant, cutthroat ecosystem where your standing was constantly under scrutiny. You'd see gentlemen, resplendent in their finery, navigating this intricate social dance, their reputations hanging by a thread thinner than the finest lace. One false step, one perceived slight, and your meticulously built social standing could crumble faster than a stale gingerbread man. Think of it like a never-ending reality show, but with far higher stakes, no voting off the island, just a quick trip to the gallows or, more commonly for gentlemen, an impromptu rendezvous with destiny on a cold, misty morning. The competition for the Queen's favor, for patronage, for lucrative appointments, was fierce. Everyone was vying for a piece of the pie, and this intense rivalry often boiled over into personal animosity. Gossip was currency, and a well-placed rumor could ruin a man. But sometimes, words weren't enough. Sometimes the only way to settle a deeply felt grievance, to reclaim a stained reputation, was through the ritualized violence of the duel. You see, the legal system, while it existed, often felt too slow, too cumbersome, or too publicly humiliating for a gentleman whose honor had been impugned. A formal court case might drag on for months, airing dirty laundry for all of London to see. A duel, however swift and deadly, offered a quicker, more personal, and perhaps, in their eyes, more honorable resolution. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of dueling was a deliberate rejection of established legal processes or simply a reflection of a society where individual honor was prized above all else. Was it an act of defiance or merely a continuation of ancient, unwritten codes? This brings us to the very bedrock of Elizabethan aristocratic life, the concept of honor. It wasn't just about being honest or virtuous in the modern sense. It was about one's public reputation, one's perceived bravery, integrity, and social standing. If someone called you a liar, a coward, or impugned your family's good name, it was an attack on your very being. To ignore such an insult was to lose face, to be shamed. And in that society, shame was a social death sentence. You might as well pack your bags and move to, well, literally anywhere else, because your career at court, your marriage prospects, your very standing among your peers would be utterly ruined. It was a tangible thing, this honor, almost like a precious jewel that had to be guarded fiercely, and the moment it was scratched, or worse, cracked, only blood could restore its luster. So, when a courtier found his honor compromised, he had a choice: cower in disgrace or respond to the challenge. And more often than not, driven by societal pressure and an ingrained sense of self-worth, he chose the latter. This wasn't just about machismo. It was a deeply embedded cultural expectation. A gentleman must defend his honor. If you didn't, you were marked, and not in a good way. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from last week? Well, this is arguably even more desperate. The prospect of facing a trained swordsman, knowing your life hangs in the balance, is terrifying enough. But imagine adding to that the societal imperative that failure to engage means utter social ruin. It's enough to make you gulp down anything, even a suspicious glass of milk, if you thought it might give you the slightest edge, a fleeting sense of security before the inevitable clash of steel. The pressure, the paranoia, the sheer weight of expectation it all built to that moment when a challenge was issued. And a duel became not just an option, but a seemingly unavoidable destiny. You're deep within the social fabric of Elizabethan England, where the air hums with unspoken challenges and slights are tallied with the precision of a moneylender. Remember that intense focus on honor we talked about? Well, and it wasn't just a quaint idea. It was a driving force that pushed otherwise sensible men towards potentially fatal encounters. Now, imagine a world before formalized police forces as we know them, before court systems were widely accessible or trusted for every slight. If someone insulted your mother, cheated you at cards, or spread a malicious rumor about your lineage, what were your options? You could grumble into your ale. Certainly, but that wouldn't restore your standing. You could petition a court, but that was slow and public. For a gentleman, there was often only one truly satisfying and socially accepted recourse: the duel. The practice of dueling, particularly with swords, it wasn't new. It had roots in older judicial combat, where God was supposedly believed to favor the righteous, thus revealing the truth through the outcome of a fight. But by the Elizabethan era, it had morphed from a divinely sanctioned trial by combat into a much more personal, almost ritualistic way for gentlemen to settle their differences and, critically, to uphold their individual honor. It was a social necessity, a bloody, violent fashion statement, if you will. You see it play out constantly in the plays of the time: the quick temper, the drawn blade, the challenge thrown down. It wasn't merely a hot-headed response. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to demonstrate courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to one's reputation. Think of it like this: if you were known to shy away from a challenge, your stock plummeted, you'd be seen as a coward, unfit for court, perhaps even unfit for polite society. Your peers would mock you, your enemies would exploit your perceived weakness, and your future prospects would evaporate faster than morning mist. So, dueling, for all its inherent danger, became a grim but necessary part of a gentleman's life. It was the ultimate show of conviction, a willingness to literally put your life on the line for your name. And in a society where so much depended on appearance and perception, this spectacle of courage was paramount. Historians still argue whether the English crown's inconsistent attempts to ban or regulate dueling actually fueled its popularity by making it seem more rebellious and therefore more honorable. Was it a genuine attempt at social control, or a tacit acknowledgement that certain forms of aristocratic violence were simply unavoidable? This evolving custom wasn't always rapier against rapier. Mind you, early forms might involve daggers or even bare fists, but by the late 16th century, the rapier was king. This long, slender, thrusting sword became the weapon of choice, favored for its elegance and deadly precision. It wasn't about hacking and slashing like a broadsword. It was about intricate footwork, parries, and precise thrusts to vital organs. A gentleman was expected to be proficient with it, almost as much as he was expected to know Latin or ride a horse. You would have practiced endlessly, sweating in the training yard, perfecting your lunges and ripostes, knowing that one day those drills might be the only thing standing between you and a cold, silent grave. So, when that insult finally came, perhaps a snide remark about your ancestry or a public insinuation of dishonesty, there was a well-trodden path to follow. You wouldn't just leap at each other in the street like common brawlers. No, there was a strict code, a ritual that had to be observed, adding to the grim theatricality of it all. And it's this ritual, this very specific set of preparations and actions, that brings us back to our curious dairy dilemma. Why, in the midst of all this deadly precision and high-stakes honor, would a man think to drink a glass of milk? It feels so utterly out of place, doesn't it? Yet it was a part of the tapestry, a thread in the elaborate, often bizarre customs that surrounded these deadly encounters. The tension would mount, the challenge delivered, and then the strange, almost childlike act of consuming a simple, white liquid. You're now fully immersed in the strange, high-stakes world of Elizabethan gentry, where every interaction is a delicate dance of power, prestige, and potential peril. We've touched on the evolution of dueling, from divine judgment to personal satisfaction, but the beating heart of it all, the very reason a man would risk his life, was the absolute all-consuming concept of honor. It wasn't just a word, it was the very air they breathed, the foundation upon which their entire existence rested. Imagine it as your most prized possession, something more valuable than land, jewels, or even life itself. Because without it, a gentleman in Elizabethan society was, quite simply, nothing. This wasn't honor in the abstract, philosophical sense we might consider today. This was palpable, immediate, and intensely personal honor. It encompassed everything: your reputation for courage, your word, your lineage, your perceived moral integrity, and your social standing. If someone publicly questioned your courage, insinuated you were a liar, or, heaven forbid, cast aspersions on your family's history, it wasn't just an insult, it was an attack on your very identity. It was a wound that festered, and unlike a physical wound, it couldn't be stitched up with needle and thread. It required a different kind of remedy. The social pressure to uphold this honor was immense. You weren't just fighting for yourself. You were fighting for your family name, for your social circle, for your very place in the elaborate hierarchy of the court. To back down from a challenge, to be seen as a coward, was a fate worse than death for many. It meant social ostracism, the end of political ambition, and potentially a life of quiet ignominy. You'd be whispered about, pointed at, and slowly but surely fade into obscurity, an unperson in a society that thrived on public perception. So, when a challenge was issued, it wasn't a choice between fighting and not fighting. It was a choice between fighting and social annihilation. You can almost feel the cold dread and the burning indignation that would fuel such a decision. It was a terrible bind, a catch-22 of the highest order: risk your life or lose it in society. This pervasive fear of dishonor created a culture where slights were magnified, where a jostle in a corridor or a cutting remark could escalate swiftly. Imagine walking through the court, constantly on guard, every interaction a potential minefield. It's no wonder these men were so tightly wound, so prone to sudden flashes of anger that could lead directly to a duel. Historians still argue whether the concept of honor in this period was a genuine moral imperative or a convenient justification for aristocratic violence and the maintenance of social control. Was it truly about integrity or a thinly veiled excuse for dominance? So, when the inevitable moment arrived, when an insult too grievous to ignore was hurled, the die was cast. The ritual of the challenge, which we'll delve into next, was not merely a formality. It was the public declaration that honor had been breached and that only steel could cleanse the stain. You'd see the tightening of jaws, the hardening of eyes as the words were spoken, and in the silence that followed, everyone present understood the grim implications. The air would thicken, The usual courtly banter would cease, replaced by a tangible tension. The challenger, having thrown down the gauntlet, so to speak, would await the response, his very reputation hanging in the balance. And the challenged, faced with the agonizing choice between social death and potential physical demise, would almost invariably choose the latter. It was a terrifying, yet almost universally accepted path. And as they prepared for this ultimate test, the peculiar custom of the pre-duel milk began to make a twisted kind of sense, not as a source of strength, but perhaps as a desperate, almost childlike, plea for protection in a world where peril was the only constant. You're standing at the precipice of a deadly encounter, an invisible line drawn in the sand of Elizabethan society. We've traced the immense weight of us honor, a burden that could push a gentleman to desperate measures. Now, let's talk about the moment of no return. The challenge issued, Sankani. This wasn't some spontaneous brawl born of drunken rage. It was a ritual, steeped in a grim etiquette, that cemented the path to a duel. You wouldn't just shout, "Meet me at dawn," though the sentiment was often as blunt. No, the challenge usually followed a specific sequence, making it undeniably clear that a man's honor had been sufficiently wounded to demand satisfaction by steel. Imagine you're at court, perhaps witnessing a heated exchange. A cutting remark is made, an accusation of cowardice, or perhaps a blatant lie is uttered about one's lineage. The air freezes, all eyes turn. The insulted party, his face a mask of controlled fury, might then deliver a carefully worded, yet unmistakable challenge. It could be a direct verbal affront, like accusing the other of being no gentleman or a knave. Sometimes it was more subtle, a contemptuous gesture, a slap of a glove across the face, or even a sneering laugh at a public gathering. You'd feel the collective intake of breath from onlookers, a sudden hush descending as everyone recognized the grim implications. This public declaration was crucial. It wasn't enough to feel insulted. The insult and the subsequent challenge had to be witnessed, to be made undeniable. This ensured that both parties were bound by the unwritten code. Once the challenge was issued and, critically, accepted, there was almost no turning back. To back down after accepting was to compound the original dishonor, to solidify one's reputation as a coward. Historians still argue whether the elaborate rituals surrounding the challenge were designed to de-escalate conflicts by allowing a cooling-off period, or if they merely served to formalize and, paradoxically, encourage violence. Was it a safety valve, or just a theatrical prelude to bloodshed? The acceptance could be as simple as a nod, a tightening of the jaw, or a grim "I shall await your seconds." Often, this meant that trusted intermediaries, known as seconds, would step in. These weren't merely cheerleaders. They were crucial negotiators. Their job was to arrange the duel, agreeing on a time, a place, and the weapons to be used. Think of them as grim event planners, ensuring that the deadly ballet unfolded according to accepted rules. They'd meet, often in secret, to hash out the details. Perhaps it would be dawn, to avoid prying eyes. Perhaps a secluded field or a remote grove. Far from the bustling city, the secrecy was often less about avoiding the law, though that was a consideration, and more about maintaining the gentlemanly nature of the affair, away from the crude gawking of the common folk. The choice of weapons was a significant point of negotiation. While we often think of the rapier and daggermont, as we'll discuss next, variations existed. Sometimes it was just rapiers, or even broadswords for those who favored a heavier blade. The seconds would also set the rules of engagement to the first blood, to incapacitation, or to the death. The latter, of course, was the most serious, and often reserved for the most grievous insults. You can imagine the tension in that clandestine meeting of seconds. Two men calmly discussing the potential demise of their principals, their words hushed, their faces grim. And through all this, the original antagonist would be preparing, perhaps practicing their thrusts and parries, honing their deadly skills, and, for some, perhaps even contemplating that strange, milky pre-duel ritual. It's a surreal image, really, the meticulous planning for such an uncivilized act, all driven by that potent, undeniable force of honor. You're now moving closer to the appointed field of honor, the chill of dawn still in the air. We've seen the raw power of an honor and the rigid protocol of the challenge issued. Now, let's talk about the instruments of death themselves, the specific tools that would decide a gentleman's fate. Choosing weapons. While broadswords and other historical blades had their place, by the Elizabethan era, a new champion of combat had emerged, one that perfectly suited the intricate, almost dance-like nature of the duel, the rapier and dagger. Imagine holding a rapier. It's not the heavy, cleaving weapon of a knight. It's long, slender, and designed for thrusting, for precise, deadly punctures. Its length, typically around 3 to 4 feet, gave it reach, and its relatively lightweight compared to earlier swords allowed for swift, agile movements. Mastering the rapier was an art form. You'd spend countless hours in the fencing master's saal, practicing intricate footwork, parries, and lunges. It wasn't about brute strength, it was about finesse, timing, and precision. A well-placed thrust could penetrate armor at a joint, or, more commonly in duels, pierce a vital organ. The tip was often needle-sharp, and the blade could be surprisingly flexible, allowing for quick adjustments in combat. But a rapier rarely came alone. Its deadly companion was the dagger, often held in the offhand. This wasn't just any old knife. It was specifically designed for close-quarters combat, for parrying, for deflecting an opponent's blade, and for delivering a swift, brutal counter-thrust. Think of it as a secondary shield and an additional, equally lethal, offensive tool. While your rapier might be keeping your opponent at a distance, the dagger could be used to trap their blade, open them up for a fatal thrust, or even deliver a disabling cut to the sword arm. Historians still argue whether the combination of rapier and dagger truly offered a superior fighting technique, or if it was simply a more fashionable and complex style that appealed to the aristocratic sensibilities of the time. Was it tactical genius, or just elaborate showmanship? The choice of these weapons wasn't arbitrary. It reflected the changing nature of combat. Warfare was evolving, and so was personal combat. Armor was becoming less common in daily wear, making precision thrusts more effective than heavy blows. The emphasis shifted from overwhelming force to elegant, deadly accuracy. A duel with rapier and dagger was a terrifying ballet, a deadly dance where one false step, one moment of hesitation, could mean your end. You'd be taught to move, to feint, to parry with the dagger and thrust with the rapier in one fluid motion, a continuous, deadly flow. Consider the training involved. Gentlemen wouldn't just pick up a sword, they were often highly skilled. Fencing schools flourished, with masters teaching the nuances of grip, stance, and attack. You'd learn to read your opponent, to anticipate their moves, to find the tiny opening that could spell victory. And as you trained, you'd be constantly aware that these theoretical lessons would soon be applied in a very real, very unforgiving context. This wasn't a game. It was preparation for a fight where your life literally hung on your skill and nerve. So, as the seconds hammered out the details of the duel, the choice of rapier and dagger signified a commitment to a particular kind of combat, one that was elegant, precise, and undeniably lethal. It wasn't about hacking and slashing like a common street brawl. It was about sophisticated, deadly artistry. And as our Elizabethan courtier contemplated his upcoming duel, he'd be visualizing the cold steel, the clash of blades, and the precise movements that he hoped would secure his victory, or at least allow him to maintain his precious honor. And as he did so, perhaps he'd cast a hopeful glance at that peculiar glass of milk, a simple, white, and seemingly benign liquid, hoping it offered some inexplicable advantage against the cold, hard reality of the blade. It's a funny thought, isn't it? A sip of milk before a dance with death. You're now firmly entrenched in the grim preparations for a duel, having seen the paramount importance of honor and the deadly elegance of rapier and dagger. Young? But no gentleman went to a duel entirely alone. Even in this intensely personal test of courage, there were crucial supporting characters, indispensable figures who ensured the ritual unfolded correctly. And, if fortune frowned, who picked up the pieces? These were the seconds and surgeons. H.R. Imagine the scene: the challenge party. Perhaps our Lord Thingamajig has accepted the challenge. His first act, after perhaps a sleepless night, is to choose his seconds. These weren't just any friends, they were typically gentlemen of standing, often experienced swordsmen themselves, and critically men whose discretion and loyalty were absolute. Their role was multifaceted and absolutely essential to the proper conduct of a duel. Firstly, they acted as intermediaries. After the challenge was issued, it was the seconds who would meet to negotiate the specifics: the time, the place, the weapons as we discussed, and the precise rules of engagement. They were like the world's most somber wedding planners, ensuring every detail of the fatal ceremony was agreed upon. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, they acted as witnesses. A duel was, by its very nature, often a clandestine affair, held away from prying eyes and the long arm of the law. But it still needed witnesses to confirm that the duel had taken place, that the rules were observed, and that honor had been satisfied. If one party died, the seconds could attest that it was a fair fight, not a murder, a crucial distinction in a time when dueling was technically illegal, though often tolerated. They would stand by, observing every parry, every thrust, ensuring no foul play, no surprise attacks, no breaches of etiquette. It was a stressful job, watching two men you knew try to kill each other, all while keeping a poker face. And then there were the surgeons. Oh, the Elizabethan surgeon. Forget modern operating rooms and sterile environments. These were men, often barbers by trade, hence the barber surgeon, who possessed a rudimentary understanding of anatomy and an even more rudimentary grasp of hygiene. Their tools were likely unsterilized, their knowledge based more on experience than scientific understanding. Yet, their presence was essential. If a duel ended with one or both parties wounded, the surgeon was there to attempt to patch them up. You'd see them with their array of knives, saws, and cauterizing irons, often arriving with their own apprentices, ready to tackle anything from a superficial cut to a gaping, mortal wound. Their methods would make you wince. Imagine a rapier thrust to the gut. The surgeon would be there, perhaps probing the wound with an unwashed finger, or applying a poultice of questionable efficacy. Pain relief was minimal to non-existent, perhaps a slug of strong ale or a bite on a leather strap. Infections were rampant, and often the cure was as deadly as the wound itself. Historians still argue whether the presence of surgeons at duels provided a false sense of security, encouraging men to engage in combat knowing there was some chance of recovery, or if it was a pragmatic acknowledgement of the inevitable consequences. Was it a comfort, or just a grim reality check? So, as our Elizabethan courtier journeyed to the dueling ground, flanked by his resolute seconds, he'd know that a surgeon, perhaps a stoic figure with bloodied hands from previous encounters, would be waiting nearby. The seconds would ensure a fair fight, and the surgeon, for better or worse, would be there for the grim aftermath. It's a bizarre tableau, really: the rigid adherence to rules, the elegant weapons, the solemn witnesses, and the crude, often terrifying medical intervention awaiting at the end. And through it all, as the final moments before the duel ticked by, our courtier might be contemplating that glass of milk, a simple white liquid in a world of complex bloody rituals, perhaps hoping it offered some internal fortitude against the external chaos. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. This is less outwardly disgusting, perhaps, but equally rooted in desperate hope and a touch of the absurd when viewed through a modern lens. The stage is almost set. The players are in position, and the tension is palpable. You're now moving with purposeful steps, the pre-dawn chill biting at your exposed skin. The only sounds the rustle of your fine clothes and the soft crunch of frost underfoot. We've seen the rigorous preparation, the crucial roles of seconds and surgeons, Arn, and the weight of honor pressing down on every decision. Now we arrive at the heart of it all, the dawn rendezvous, the chosen field of honor. Imagine it. It's not a brightly lit arena with cheering crowds. This is typically a secluded, almost forgotten patch of land, far enough from prying eyes to maintain discretion, but close enough to be accessible. Perhaps it's a quiet meadow on the outskirts of London, still shrouded in mist, or a clearing deep within a wooded estate. The air is cold and damp, carrying the scent of damp earth and perhaps a lingering hint of last night's dew. You can almost feel the prickle of goosebumps on your arms, not just from the cold, but from the raw, undeniable tension that hangs heavy in the air. This isn't a place for casual strolls or Sunday picnics. This is where life hangs by a thread. The journey there would have been somber. No boisterous chatter, no light-hearted jests. The principals, accompanied by their seconds, would travel in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. For the challenged, it might be a review of fencing techniques, a desperate prayer, or perhaps a final, fleeting thought of loved ones. For the challenger, it would be a grim satisfaction, a hardening of resolve to wipe away the stain on his name. You might hear the distant crow of a rooster, or the faint bleating of sheep from a nearby farm, incongruous sounds in such a deadly setting. The world around you is waking up to another day, oblivious to the life or death drama about to unfold. As you arrive, the scene is stark. Two small groups of men facing each other across the dewy grass. The seconds, ever vigilant, would be surveying the ground, ensuring it was even free of hidden obstacles that might give one party an unfair advantage. They'd mark out the ground, perhaps with cloaks or a few paces, defining the deadly arena. The surgeon, a silent, almost spectral figure, would be standing a little apart, his bag of crude instruments likely clanking softly at his feet, ready for the inevitable. Historians still debate whether the choice of remote locations for duels was primarily to avoid legal consequences or to add to the mystique and gravity of the event, making it a truly private affair between gentlemen. Was it about evasion or elevation? The light would be just beginning to break, a pale, anemic glow in the east, slowly banishing the shadows. This wasn't merely for aesthetics. Low light offered a degree of concealment, making it harder for witnesses to precisely identify the combatants, and also added to the overall somber, almost gothic atmosphere. The world feels hushed, as if even nature holds its breath for what is to come. You can practically hear your own heartbeat, a frantic drum in your chest, even though you are merely an observer. This is it, the culmination of an insult, the desperate need for satisfaction, all boiling down to this single, chilling moment. And for our courtier, as he sheds his cloak, perhaps adjusts his shirt, and takes up his chosen weapon, the image of that glass of milk might flash in his mind one last time. Did he feel a soothing warmth in his stomach? Did it provide a fleeting sense of internal fortification against the cold steel he was about to face? Or was it just a desperate, perhaps superstitious, gesture, a gulp of something pure and unassuming before stepping into a realm of violence and blood? The air crackles with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the nervous shifting of feet, and the knowledge that in mere moments, the only sound will be the ringing clash of steel. You're standing on the edge of the duel, the cold, damp air a sharp contrast to the burning tension within. The seconds have stepped back, the surgeon is poised, and the weapons are drawn. But before the first parry, before the deadly dance truly begins, we need to return to our strange, milky mystery. We've hinted at it, you've probably scoffed at it, but now it's time to truly delve into the milk's role not just for bones. At first glance, the idea of drinking milk before a duel seems utterly absurd, doesn't it? Like bringing a spoon to a knife fight? In our modern minds, milk is for strong bones, for breakfast cereal, maybe for a soothing nightcap. We associate it with childhood, with wholesome nutrition, certainly not with impending mortal combat. But remember, the Elizabethans operated under a very different understanding of the human body, medicine, and the unseen forces that influence their world. Their reasoning, however flawed by today's standards, made a twisted kind of sense to them. One prevailing, though ultimately mistaken, theory revolved around the idea of coating the stomach. This wasn't about preventing indigestion, mind you, or protecting against a bad case of heartburn. No, the belief was that milk, particularly full-fat milk, could form a protective layer on the inside of the stomach and digestive tract. Why would this matter before a duel? Well, it ties into a deep-seated fear that permeated Elizabethan society, a fear far more insidious and less overt than a rapier thrust. Poison. You see, in an age of political intrigue, personal vendettas, and rudimentary forensic science, poisoning was a terrifyingly common and often untraceable method of assassination. Courts were rife with whispers of poisoned wines, tainted meals, and slow-acting concoctions. If you were a prominent figure, you lived with a constant, nagging paranoia that any food or drink offered to you could be your last. This wasn't just idle speculation. There are historical accounts and literary references aplenty detailing the fear of being removed by subtle means. Historians still argue whether the actual incidence of poisoning was as widespread as the public paranoia suggested, or if the fear itself became a tool of power and control, a constant shadow over court life. Was it a real threat, or an exaggerated anxiety that served other purposes? So, if you believed that your opponent might not play fair, that they might have attempted to poison you before the duel, perhaps at a shared meal, or even by tainting the very water you drank, then drinking milk could be seen as a desperate, last-ditch attempt at self-preservation. The logic, however flawed, was this: if you ingested a poison, the milk would either absorb it, dilute it, or create a barrier that prevented its immediate absorption into your bloodstream. It was a kind of internal, liquid armor. You might imagine the courtier, pale with nerves, forcing down the milky liquid, a grimacing gulp fueled by a desperate hope that this simple act could save him from an unseen, internal enemy, even as he prepared to face a very visible, external one. This belief in milk's protective qualities extends beyond common nutritional beliefs of the time. It wasn't about the calcium or the protein. It was about its perceived magical or medicinal properties. It was a folk remedy, a whisper passed down through generations, elevated to a desperate measure in a desperate situation. The sheer irony, and of course, is that while our courtier might have been concerned about a hidden poison, the immediate and most pressing danger was a piece of sharp, pointed steel headed straight for his vital organs. Yet, in the terrifying uncertainty of a duel, any perceived advantage, no matter how outlandish, would be clutched at like a lifeline. The mental comfort, the illusion of safety, might have been just as important as any imagined physical effect. You're still standing on that hushed field, the mist clinging to the ground, the duelist contemplating not just the blade before him, but the potential unseen threats within. We just scratched the surface of that strange belief that milk could act as a shield, a sort of internal armor. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the specific theory of our stomach lining a shield of sorts. In the Elizabethan era, the understanding of human anatomy and physiology was, shall we say, a work in progress. Doctors, or rather, barber surgeons and apothecaries, operated largely on theories passed down from ancient Greek and Roman physicians, often without the benefit of modern scientific inquiry. One prominent, though ultimately erroneous, belief was that the stomach and intestines were incredibly vulnerable to corrosive substances. They didn't understand acids or chemical reactions in the way we do now, but they certainly knew that some ingested substances could cause violent illness or death. So, the logic, as twisted as it sounds to our modern ears, went something like this: if you consume a rich, fatty liquid like milk, it would effectively grease the wheels of your digestive tract, or more specifically, coat the internal membranes. This supposed coating, a layer of milk and its constituent fats, was believed to create a temporary barrier. The idea was that if a poison or even a highly irritating substance were ingested, the milk would prevent it from immediately adhering to, or being absorbed by, the delicate tissues of the stomach lining. It was thought to act like a temporary, edible Teflon coating, allowing the poison to pass through or be rendered less effective. You can almost picture it, a mental image of a milky film clinging to the insides, bravely standing between you and certain doom. It's hilariously misguided, of course, but for someone facing a potentially poisoned drink, it offered a sliver of desperate hope. This belief wasn't entirely unique to milk. By the way, other fatty or absorbent substances were sometimes recommended for similar purposes. Think of it like taking a spoonful of olive oil to ward off an upset stomach, but dialed up to 11 and applied to a life or death scenario. The point was to create a physical buffer, however flimsy, against a perceived internal threat. Historians still argue whether this specific belief in a stomach coating was a genuine, widespread medical theory of the time, or more of a folk remedy passed through generations, fueled by anecdote and desperation. Was it taught in nascent medical schools, or whispered in the servants' quarters? The fact that this belief was applied to the pre-duel ritual underscores the deep-seated poison paranoia we touched upon earlier. Even in a situation where the primary threat was a sword thrust, the unseen danger of poison lingered in the back of their minds. It's like being worried about a mosquito bite when you're about to fight a tiger. But for the Elizabethan courtier, the tiger was real, and the mosquito, though smaller, could be equally deadly and far more insidious. This pervasive fear meant that any measure, no matter how illogical to us, that offered even a theoretical defense against poisoning would be embraced. So, our duelist, steeling his nerves for the clang of blades, might take that gulp of milk, imagining it forming an invisible, creamy shield within him. It was a ritualistic act, a gesture of defiance against unseen enemies, even as he prepared to face a very visible one. It offered not just potential physical protection, however misguided, but also a powerful psychological comfort. In a world full of uncertainty and hidden dangers, a simple glass of milk became a tiny beacon of perceived safety, a desperate attempt to control at least one variable in an otherwise uncontrollable, deadly situation. You can almost feel the cold dread of knowing that even if you win the duel, you might have already been condemned by a silent, invisible killer. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? This is less about external appearance and more about internal, almost magical, protection. You're still standing there, on that misty field of honor, the chill seeping into your bones, contemplating the bizarre logic of our Elizabethan duelist. We've explored the idea of milk as a cordon, stomach lining at protector, a shield against unseen internal threats. But this brings us back, full circle, to the truly chilling undercurrent of the era. Poison paranoia, a constant fear. This wasn't merely a fleeting worry, it was a pervasive, almost suffocating anxiety that permeated every level of Elizabethan society, from the lowest scullery maid to the queen herself. Imagine living in a world where a sudden illness, a rapid decline in health, or an unexplained death could easily be attributed to poison. There were no sophisticated forensic labs, no toxicology reports to confirm or deny foul play. If someone important died unexpectedly, especially someone with enemies or rivals, the immediate suspicion often fell upon poison. This made it a particularly attractive tool for those seeking to remove obstacles or settle scores without the overt violence of a sword fight, which could lead to public scandal or even execution. It was the silent killer, the perfect weapon for the cunning and the desperate. The court, in particular, was a hotbed of this fear. With ambition running high and power constantly shifting, rivals were everywhere: a discarded mistress, a disgruntled courtier, a political opponent. Any of them could resort to such dark arts. You'd hear whispers in the corridors, hushed rumors of mysterious ailments and sudden demises. It created an atmosphere of deep distrust. How do you know if the wine offered to you by a smiling rival is truly safe? How can you be sure the sweetmeat you just consumed wasn't prepared with a deadly ingredient? The uncertainty was tormenting. Historians still argue whether the actual incidence of poisoning was as high as contemporary accounts suggest, or if the widespread fear and superstition amplified every sudden death into a suspected assassination. Was it a true epidemic of insidious murder, or a reflection of the era's medical ignorance and pervasive paranoia? This poison paranoia wasn't just confined to the elite either. While courtly intrigues offered fertile ground, the fear trickled down to everyday life. Apothecaries who mixed remedies could also, theoretically, mix poisons. Knowledge of various herbs and their properties, both medicinal and toxic, was widespread, albeit often based on folklore rather than rigorous science. So, the threat felt real and ever-present, lurking in the shadows of daily existence. Think of the psychological impact of living under such a cloud. Every meal, every drink, every minor stomach upset could trigger an internal alarm. It's enough to make anyone desperate for any perceived antidote or preventative measure. This is where milk, with its perceived stomach-coating properties, gained traction. It wasn't necessarily seen as a magic bullet, but as a potential safeguard, a little extra insurance against a silent, unseen attack. Our duelist, preparing for battle, wasn't just thinking about the immediate physical threat of his opponent's blade. He was also contemplating the possibility that he might have been weakened, or even doomed, by an insidious agent hours or days before. So, as he grips his rapier, feeling the cool weight of the steel, he might still be feeling the warmth of that milk in his stomach, clinging to the desperate hope that it offered some protection against the ultimate betrayal. This constant fear of poison underscores the volatile and dangerous nature of Elizabethan life, where even moments before a public display of honor, a private, hidden terror could still prey on a man's mind. It's a testament to the era's blend of courage and sheer, unadulterated dread, a world where the most immediate threat might not be the sharpest blade, but the quietest sip. You're still standing in that spectral light of dawn, the tension coiling around you like a cold serpent, as our duelist grapples with both the visible threat of steel and the invisible dread of poison. We've established the pervasive poison paranoia that haunted Elizabethan society. This fear, coupled with a rudimentary understanding of medicine, gave rise to a powerful, albeit mistaken, belief. The antidote myth milk as a cure, all tum. In an age before scientifically proven antidotes, people grasped at anything that promised relief or protection from toxins, and for many, milk seemed to fit the bill perfectly. It was a common, widely available substance, perceived as pure and wholesome. This perception likely fueled the myth that it possessed inherent remedial powers against a wide array of ailments, including, crucially, poisoning. Think of it less as a precise medical understanding and more as a folk belief, a piece of inherited wisdom passed down through generations, often without any real basis in fact. Drink milk, it'll make you feel better, was likely a common refrain, applied to everything from stomach aches to suspected poisonings. The logic, however flawed, went something like this: milk is a nourishing substance. It is white and pure, and it is easily digestible. Therefore, it must have a cleansing or neutralizing effect. If something bad was inside you, milk would either absorb it, dilute it, or somehow render it harmless. It was seen as a universal panacea, a natural remedy for almost anything that went wrong internally. This was particularly true for irritant poisons, where the immediate effect was often stomach upset and burning. People might have observed that drinking milk temporarily soothed the burning sensation, mistakenly believing it was neutralizing the poison rather than just coating the irritated tissues. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in milk's antidotal properties was a unique English phenomenon or part of a broader European tradition of using dairy products in folk medicine. Was it a local superstition or a pan-continental medical fallacy? This myth wasn't entirely baseless in its intent. In situations where a strong acid or alkali was ingested, milk can offer a temporary diluting and soothing effect on the lining of the esophagus and stomach, similar to how it was believed to coat the stomach against poisons. However, for most actual poisons, this effect is negligible at best and potentially dangerous at worst, as it might delay or prevent proper medical intervention. But in the absence of scientific knowledge, observation of these temporary soothing effects could easily be misinterpreted as genuine antidotal properties. So we out for our duelist, facing not just the physical threat of a sword, but the mental terror of having possibly been poisoned. A glass of milk offered not just a theoretical shield, but a profound psychological comfort. It was a ritualistic act of defiance against a hidden enemy. It's like wearing your lucky socks to a job interview, but with far higher stakes and a much more literal interpretation of warding off evil. The sheer power of belief, especially in times of extreme stress, can be incredibly strong. That simple white liquid, in their minds, became a symbol of purification and protection, a last-ditch effort to cleanse the body and prepare it for the ultimate test. This pervasive antidote myth highlights the blend of desperation, rudimentary medical understanding, and deep-seated superstition that characterized Elizabethan life. They were a people caught between the fading echoes of medieval magical thinking and the nascent stirrings of scientific inquiry. And in that liminal space, a glass of milk could transform from a simple dairy product into a potent, if ultimately ineffective, weapon against the unseen horrors that haunted their world. As our duelist grips his rapier, his eyes fixed on his opponent, he might feel a fleeting sense of reassurance from the milk within, a false comfort that allowed him to push aside the gnawing fear of poison and focus on the fight at hand. It's a reminder that even in the face of brute force, the mind often seeks solace in the unlikeliest of places. You're still breathing the damp, pre-dawn air on the dueling ground, the peculiar ritual of the milk still fresh in your mind. We've explored the desperate belief in milk as a cure, all usher against the backdrop of pervasive poison paranoia. But where did this intense fear of poisoning truly stem from? Beyond mere speculation, it was deeply intertwined with the very fabric of Elizabethan political life. On courtly conspiracies, a web of intrigue. Imagine Queen Elizabeth's court not just as a place of grand ceremonies and political machinations, but as a densely woven tapestry of ambition, jealousy, and profound distrust. Every noble family, every prominent courtier was constantly jockeying for position, for the Queen's favor, for wealth, and for power. And where there is intense competition for high stakes, there is often unscrupulous behavior. Poison, in an age without reliable forensics, was the perfect weapon for covert warfare. It left no visible wound, no sword mark, no telltale signs of a struggle, a sudden illness, a lingering decline, an unexpected death. All could be attributed to natural causes, even if suspicion simmered beneath the surface. Think of figures like Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, a favorite of the Queen, who was constantly surrounded by rumors of foul play. His wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances, falling down a flight of stairs. While modern historians largely attribute it to an accident or illness, at the time, whispers of poison were rife, fueled by Dudley's ambition and his desire to marry the Queen. This was just one prominent example. Courtiers often kept detailed records of their enemies, their movements, and their perceived threats. The air was thick with spies and informers, each trying to gain an advantage by revealing secrets or fabricating them. Historians still argue whether the numerous accusations of poisoning in Elizabethan England were largely genuine attempts at murder, or if they were often politically motivated smears designed to discredit rivals and sow discord. Was it widespread chemical warfare, or primarily psychological warfare? This deep-seated paranoia wasn't merely a backdrop, it influenced daily life. You might hesitate before accepting a drink from a rival, or subtly watch who poured your wine at a banquet. The very servants around you could be informants, or worse, agents of your enemies. Letters could be intercepted, coded messages could be passed, and plots hatched in the darkest corners of the palace. It was a constant game of chess, where the pieces were human lives and the stakes were immense. The threat of being discreetly poisoned meant that a gentleman had to be perpetually on guard, not just against direct attacks, but against the insidious, hidden ones. So, when a duel was agreed upon, particularly one born of deep-seated animosity or political rivalry, the fear of poison might escalate. It wasn't just about the fair fight on the field. It was about the possibility that one's opponent, or their allies, might have tried to weaken them before the confrontation. Perhaps a poisoned drink was slipped into their supper the night before, or a slow-acting toxin administered days earlier. This deep-seated suspicion, a consequence of the web of intrigue that was court life, provided a compelling, if misguided, rationale for desperate measures like drinking milk. Our duelist, standing on that cold, damp ground, would be wrestling with not just the immediate terror of the rapier, but the chilling thought that he might have already been condemned by an unseen hand. The milk, in this context, wasn't just a physical buffer, it was a psychological reassurance, a symbolic cleansing against the dark arts of courtly conspiracies. It offered a fragile sense of control in a world where control was constantly being wrested away by hidden enemies. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a watering can, knowing full well the inferno is fueled by 1,000 hidden resentments and betrayals. The perceived safety, however illusory, was perhaps as vital as any imagined physical benefit, allowing the courtier to face his visible enemy with a fraction more courage, a sliver more hope in a truly terrifying age. You're still on the edge of the dueling ground, the chill of dawn sharpening the air, contemplating the Elizabethan courtier's peculiar reliance on milk before a deadly encounter. We've seen how courtly conspiracies fueled an intense, poison paranoia, making any perceived antidote seem vital. Now let's consider another powerful influence shaping these seemingly irrational beliefs. Herbal lore, ancient wisdom's influence. Now, in Elizabethan England, modern pharmacology was centuries away. Medical knowledge was a complex, often contradictory blend of classical texts, folk remedies, and empirical observation. For centuries, across Europe, people had relied heavily on the natural world for healing, for sustenance, and for protection. This vast body of knowledge, often passed down orally through generations, was known as herbal lore. It was a tapestry woven from practical experience, superstition, and a healthy dose of magical thinking. Every plant, every root, every berry was believed to possess specific properties, whether for curing ailments, warding off evil, or, indeed, for poisoning. Imagine a world where the local wise woman, or the village apothecary, held more sway than a formally trained physician for everyday ills. These individuals often had deep, albeit unscientific, knowledge of herbs. They knew which plants could soothe a fever, which could induce sleep, and crucially, which could cause illness or death. This dual nature of plants, as both medicine and poison, was well understood, and this understanding contributed significantly to the fear of poisoning. If a simple, innocuous-looking plant could be dried and powdered to bring about a slow, agonizing death, then who was truly safe? This ancient wisdom, or at least the popular interpretation of it, certainly played into the belief about milk's properties. While milk itself isn't an herb, it was a natural product, often seen as pure and life-giving. In the context of herbal lore, where specific plants were believed to counteract specific poisons, think of an antidote being derived from an opposing plant. Milk might have been viewed as a general neutralizer, a pure substance that could somehow cleanse or counteract the impure effects of a toxin. It was a broad-stroke approach, born of desperation and a lack of precise scientific understanding. Historians still argue whether the reliance on herbal lore for serious conditions, like suspected poisoning, reflected a genuine belief in its efficacy or a pragmatic acceptance that better medical options simply didn't exist for the vast majority of the populace. Was it true faith in nature's remedies, or simply making do with what was available? You might hear tales of specific herbs that could be mixed with food to cause stomach cramps, or ones that induced a debilitating lethargy. And if these herbs were known, then surely there must be other natural substances that could counter their effects. Right milk, with its soothing and coating properties as they perceived them, would have seemed like a logical candidate in this framework of ancient, often anecdotal, remedies. It's like a medieval version of an apple a day, but applied to deadly toxins. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from way back? That was a topical application of folk wisdom. This is an internal one. So, for our duelist, standing in the pre-dawn mist, the cultural echoes of neo-ancient wisdom would surely influence his thinking. The decision to drink milk wasn't just a random act. It was steeped in a long tradition of trying to harness nature's power for protection. It was a nod to generations of unwritten knowledge, a desperate hope that this simple, natural substance could somehow shield him from the insidious effects of a hidden poison, allowing him to focus on the more immediate, visible threat of his opponent's blade. It adds another layer to the peculiar tableau of the Elizabethan duel, a blend of sophisticated swordplay, rigid honor codes, and deeply ingrained, often superstitious, beliefs about the body and the world around it. The ritual of the milk becomes less about scientific efficacy and more about a cultural inheritance of desperate, hopeful self-preservation. You're still on the edge of the dueling ground, the raw morning air biting at your cheeks. As our courtier prepares to face his fate, we've delved into the powerful, often misguided influence of herbal lore and the pervasive fear of poison on them. But what about the professional guidance of the era? Who did people turn to for medical advice? And what did they actually recommend? This brings us to the physician's advice, quackery or science. In Elizabethan England, the medical landscape was a chaotic mix of traditional practices, emerging scientific thought, and outright charlatanism. There were indeed formally educated physicians, often trained at universities like Oxford or Cambridge, who studied ancient texts from Hippocrates and Galen. These individuals were usually reserved for the very wealthy elite. Their treatments often involved complex theories about humors, the four bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and their balance, leading to practices like bloodletting, purging, and the administration of elaborate, often ineffective, concoctions. Below them were the apothecaries who mixed and dispensed medicines, and the barber surgeons who performed manual procedures like amputations, tooth extractions, and setting bones. And then there was a vast array of unlicensed practitioners, cunning women, and quacks who peddled everything from magical charms to dubious elixirs. The line between genuine healing and outright fraud was often blurry. You'd see advertisements for miraculous cures, often promising to banish all manner of ills, from the plague to a broken heart. The public, desperate for relief and often uneducated, was vulnerable to these claims. Historians still argue whether the medical practices of the time, even those by esteemed physicians, were genuinely beneficial, or if patient recovery was more often due to the body's natural healing processes and a hefty dose of placebo effect. Was it primitive science or sophisticated superstition? When it came to something as terrifying and mysterious as poison, the advice offered by these medical professionals, or indeed the self-proclaimed experts, would have been varied and often contradictory. Given the prevalent poison paranoia, it's highly probable that some physicians, perhaps genuinely believing in its efficacy or simply adhering to established folk wisdom, might have recommended milk as a temporary measure against toxins. They might not have understood why they thought it worked beyond anecdotal evidence or ancient texts, but in the absence of better options, it was a commonly accepted theory. It would be seen as a benign, easily accessible substance, unlikely to cause further harm, and potentially offering some comfort. Imagine a physician, in his velvet gown and solemn demeanor, nodding gravely as he prescribes a specific blend of herbs and perhaps, as an adjunct, a large draught of milk, believing it would coat the stomach or cleanse the system. To our modern ears, it sounds like something out of a farcical play, but to the Elizabethans, this was serious medical counsel. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen from way back? This is a similar level of scientific rigor applied to internal medicine. The belief in its efficacy would have been amplified by the sheer lack of alternatives and the profound fear that drove people to seek any potential remedy. So, for our duelist, preparing for his duel, the idea of drinking milk might not have been just a personal superstition. It might have been reinforced by the advice of those he considered authorities on health. Whether that advice truly stemmed from empirical observation, ancient texts, or simply the echo chamber of popular belief, it added another layer of legitimacy to this peculiar pre-duel ritual. It underscored the desperate lengths to which individuals would go to feel a modicum of control in a world teeming with invisible threats and very visible dangers. The milk was a tangible act, a desperate sip of hope against the overwhelming tide of uncertainty, a personal act of preparing for the fight, both external and internal. You're still on the edge of the dueling ground, the first hint of sunlight piercing the mist, watching our Elizabethan courtier prepare for his deadly confrontation. We've explored the misguided medical advice and the deep-seated fears that might have led him to drink milk. But beyond any perceived physical benefit, there's a powerful, often overlooked dimension to this ritual. It's a psychological edge, a calming elixir. Airing. Imagine the scene from the duelist's perspective. You've accepted a challenge, knowing that in moments, you'll be facing a man determined to kill you. Your life, your honor, your future, all hang precariously on the razor's edge of a sword. The adrenaline would be coursing through your veins, your heart pounding like a drum, your hands perhaps trembling slightly. Fear, raw and primal, would be a constant companion. Even the bravest of men would feel it. This isn't just about physical skill, it's about mental fortitude, about maintaining composure when every fiber of your being screams for flight. In such a high-stress situation, anything that could settle the nerves, provide a sense of control, or simply offer a momentary distraction would be invaluable. And this is where milk, surprisingly, might have played its most potent role. Think about it, milk is a simple, familiar substance. It's associated with comfort, with childhood, with nourishment. In a world spiraling into chaos, the act of drinking something so seemingly benign could provide a profound sense of calm, a psychological anchor in a storm of terror. It's like a grown man clutching his childhood teddy bear before a big presentation, but with real swords involved. The very ritual of preparing and consuming the milk could serve as a mental exercise, a moment to gather one's thoughts, to focus, to push away the overwhelming fear. The physical act of swallowing, the cool liquid sliding down the throat, could be a grounding sensation amidst the anxiety. It provides a brief respite, a small personal ceremony before the grim reality of the duel. Historians still argue whether the psychological benefits of such rituals, however irrational they may seem, were truly recognized and consciously employed by the duelists themselves, or if they were merely a byproduct of deeply ingrained superstitious habits. Was it a deliberate coping mechanism or an unconscious comfort? Moreover, the belief that milk offered some kind of protection, however misguided, would have contributed to this calming effect. If you genuinely believed that this simple drink was giving you an edge, whether against poison or simply by fortifying you internally, that belief itself could boost your confidence. It's the placebo effect, centuries before it was formally understood. The mind is a powerful thing, and if it believes something is helping, even if it's not, that conviction can translate into increased bravery, focus, and reduced panic. A confident duelist, even if his confidence is based on a dairy product, is arguably a more formidable opponent than one consumed by terror. So, As our Elizabethan courtier takes that final gulp of milk, his eyes fixed on his opponent, he might feel a subtle shift within him. The churning in his stomach might subside, his breathing might steady, and a fragile sense of resolve might settle over him. It wasn't about brute strength, nor about some miraculous antidote. It was about managing the terror, about finding a fleeting moment of peace before the storm. The milk, in this context, becomes less about its chemical properties and more about its symbolic power. A small act of self-soothing in the face of overwhelming dread. It underscores the profoundly human element of these deadly encounters, that even the bravest among us seek solace, however strange, when staring death in the face. You're still on the edge of the dueling ground, the tension a tangible thing in the pre-dawn air, and our courtier has perhaps just finished his peculiar, milky fortifier. We've considered the psychological edge milk might have offered, but to fully grasp its significance, we must immerse ourselves deeper into the mindset of the era, superstition's grip, ritual, and belief. But fun. Elizabethan England was a fascinating paradox, a society on the cusp of scientific revolution, yet still deeply steeped in magic, omens, and ancient folk beliefs. While figures like Francis Bacon were laying the groundwork for empirical science, the vast majority of people, from peasants to courtiers, lived lives guided by superstition. Everything from the phases of the moon to the flight of birds, from a black cat crossing your path to an unexpected sneeze, could be interpreted as a sign, an omen, or a precursor to good or ill fortune. Imagine a world without a clear understanding of disease, natural phenomena, or even basic hygiene. When things went wrong, when crops failed, or loved ones fell ill, people often looked for supernatural explanations. This led to a reliance on charms, amulets, and specific rituals believed to ward off evil, attract good luck, or provide protection. These weren't necessarily seen as irrational acts. Rather, they were accepted methods of influencing an unpredictable world. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in magic and superstition was a sign of intellectual backwardness or a rational coping mechanism in an era of profound uncertainty and limited scientific understanding. Was it ignorance or a necessary framework for navigating an unpredictable world? In the context of a duel, where life and death hung precariously in the balance, the stakes were incredibly high, and the desire for any kind of advantage, however small or symbolic, would have been overwhelming. A duelist wasn't just relying on his skill with a blade. He was also hoping for luck, for divine favor, or for some magical protection. This is where ritual and belief intertwined with practical preparation. The milk, therefore, wasn't just a potential stomach liner or a calming drink. It was likely part of a broader set of personal superstitions and customs performed before such a dire event. Perhaps our courtier had a lucky charm he always wore, or a specific prayer he recited, or a particular gesture he made before drawing his sword. The act of drinking milk could have easily become another one of these deeply ingrained rituals. It might have been something his father or grandfather did, or a custom he picked up from a fencing master, or even something he decided upon himself after a particularly close call in a previous encounter. The efficacy wasn't as important as the act itself, the feeling that you were doing everything in your power to stack the odds in your favor, however subtly. Think of it like a modern athlete with a pregame ritual, always putting on the left sock first, or bouncing the ball exactly 5 times before a free throw. For them, it's not about logic, it's about control, about creating a sense of certainty in an uncertain situation. The Elizabethan duelists' pre-duel milk likely served a similar purpose, amplified by the literal life and death stakes. It provided a sense of agency, a feeling that one was not entirely at the mercy of fate. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? While outwardly absurd, it too stemmed from a similar blend of desperation and folkloric belief. So, as our duelist readies himself, his movements precise, his gaze steady, a part of his mind might still be clinging to the comforting thought of that milk. It's a reminder that even in the most formal and deadly of rituals, Human beings cling to their beliefs, however irrational, when facing the abyss. The milk became a tangible manifestation of a deeply ingrained superstition, a silent prayer for protection whispered through a simple, white liquid. Amidst the clash of steel and the grim silence of the dawn, you're still on the edge of the dueling ground, the raw energy of the impending conflict almost palpable. We've considered on superstition's grip and the psychological solace milk offered. Now, let's pivot to a more mundane, yet still significant, interpretation of the pre-duel milk, the concept of a last meal, a final nourishment. While the idea of a last meal immediately conjures images of condemned prisoners and elaborate culinary requests, for the duelist, it was far more pragmatic and potentially far more immediate. Duels were typically fought at dawn. This wasn't just for secrecy. As we discussed, it was also because the early morning light was often dim and atmospheric, adding to the gravitas, and crucial, it meant the combatants would likely be fighting on an empty stomach. Imagine waking before first light, nerves frayed, stomach churning with anxiety. You wouldn't have time for a leisurely breakfast of eggs, bacon, and toast. The moments leading up to a duel would be consumed by mental preparation, perhaps a final review of tactics, prayers, or grim contemplation. Yet fighting on an entirely empty stomach, especially when facing a life-or-death physical exertion, is far from ideal. You'd be lightheaded, perhaps weak, and your concentration might waver. This is where milk as a form of final nourishment comes into play. It's quickly digestible, provides some caloric intake, and can help settle an anxious stomach without feeling heavy or causing discomfort. A hearty meal might lead to indigestion or sluggishness, precisely what you don't want when facing a skilled swordsman. Milk, on the other hand, offers a gentle boost of energy and can provide a calming, soothing sensation. It's practical, simple, and readily available in an agrarian society. Historians still argue whether the consumption of milk was a deliberate strategy for light sustenance or merely a convenient liquid for those unable to stomach more solid food due to nerves. Was it a planned nutritional intake or a concession to anxiety? Think of it from a purely physical standpoint. Even a relatively short duel, perhaps only a few minutes of intense swordplay, requires considerable energy. Your muscles would be working hard, your heart rate soaring. A complete lack of sustenance could lead to fatigue, dizziness, or a drop in blood sugar, all of which could be fatal disadvantages in a sword fight. A glass of milk, while not a feast, could provide just enough readily available fuel to get through the initial burst of combat. Furthermore, consider the social aspect. While the duel itself was secret, the journey to the site and the presence of seconds and surgeons meant a gentleman would not be completely alone. Offering a glass of milk could also be an act of shared sustenance, a quiet gesture of support from a second to his principal, a final moment of shared humanity before descending into violence. It's a subtle, understated element, but not insignificant. So, as our Elizabethan courtier takes that final draft of milk, his mind might be focused not just on psychological comfort or protection from poison, but also on the immediate, practical need to fuel his body for the ordeal ahead. It's a prosaic explanation, certainly, perhaps lacking the drama of hidden poisons and ancient curses, but it grounds the ritual in a very human need for basic sustenance and physical readiness. In the cold, harsh light of dawn, with a duel looming, even a simple glass of milk could represent a strategic advantage, a final, quiet act of preparing the body for the ultimate test of strength and skill. The paradox remains a simple, nourishing drink preparing a man for a deadly, unspeakable act. You're still standing vigil on the misty dueling ground, the solemnity of the moment intensified by the pale light of dawn. We've explored the practical implications of milk as final nourishment and its role in settling nerves. Now, let's consider a deeper, more spiritual dimension that would have profoundly influenced the Elizabethan duelist. Her religious overtones seeking absolution. Cracum. Elizabethan England was a deeply religious society, albeit one undergoing significant upheaval due to the Reformation. Protestantism was the official religion, but Catholicism still held sway in the hearts of many, and the fear of divine judgment was pervasive. For a gentleman contemplating a duel, a practice officially condemned by both church and state, even if often tolerated in practice, the spiritual implications would have been immense. He was, in essence, about to commit an act of premeditated violence that could lead to his own death, or the death of another. This placed his immortal soul in grave peril. Imagine the internal struggle. On one hand, the unyielding demand of honor, a social code that compelled him to fight. On the other, the stark warnings of the church against murder and engaging in private combat. Dying in a duel, particularly if you were the aggressor, could be seen as dying in a state of sin, condemning your soul to eternal damnation. This terrifying prospect would have weighed heavily on the minds of many duelists, far more than the physical pain of a sword wound. This is where the rituals surrounding the duel, including seemingly innocuous ones like drinking milk, could take on religious overtones. While milk itself isn't a sacred substance, its perceived purity and life-giving qualities could have imbued it with symbolic significance. In some cultures and historical periods, milk has been associated with cleansing, with blessings, or with purity. It might have been seen as a symbolic act of purification, a desperate plea for divine favor, or, at the very least, a small gesture to mitigate the sin he was about to commit. Before facing death, many would have engaged in fervent prayer, perhaps confessed their sins to a chaplain if one was available and brave enough to attend such an illicit affair, or made a final act of contrition. The milk could have been integrated into this broader quest for absolution. It's a subtle point, but not insignificant. In a time when the afterlife was a very real and terrifying prospect, anything that could soothe a troubled conscience or offer a sliver of hope for salvation would have been embraced. Historians still argue whether the religious anxieties surrounding dueling genuinely deterred many potential combatants, or if the social imperative of honor simply outweighed spiritual concerns for most gentlemen. Was it a constant internal conflict, or did society's rules simply trump divine ones? Consider the psychological comfort this would provide. If you truly believed that drinking this pure white liquid, perhaps with a whispered prayer, somehow prepared your soul for what was to come, it could calm your spirit just as much as it supposedly calmed your stomach. It offered a moment of spiritual grounding before leaping into the abyss. It's like a last-minute confession, a quick cleansing before potentially facing your maker. So, as our Elizabethan courtier took that gulp of milk, his mind might have been racing not just with fencing strategies or fears of poison, but with a profound spiritual dread. The milk, in this context, transcends its mundane origins and becomes a symbol of hope, a silent plea for grace, a desperate attempt to reconcile the earthly demands of honor with the eternal demands of his soul. It adds a layer of poignant complexity to the ritual, transforming a simple drink into a desperate act of faith in the shadow of impending death. You're still on that silent, misty field, the duel about to commence, and the layers of meaning behind that glass of milk continue to unfold. We've touched upon the profound religious overtones and the desperate search for absolution. Now, let's zoom out and consider perhaps the most powerful force driving these peculiar customs: social pressure conformity to custom. Imagine living in a society where your entire identity, your worth, and your future depended almost entirely on the good opinion of your peers. Elizabethan England was precisely that kind of place, particularly for the gentry and nobility. From your clothes to your manners, from your political allegiances to how you settled disputes, every aspect of your life was under scrutiny. To deviate from established norms, to refuse to participate in accepted rituals, was not merely unconventional, it was often social suicide. The custom of dueling, for all its inherent danger and legal condemnation, became deeply ingrained in aristocratic culture. It was seen as the ultimate test of a gentleman's courage and honor, To refuse a challenge or to shy away from its associated rituals was to brand oneself a coward, a man unworthy of respect. This wasn't a choice. It was a societal imperative. You couldn't simply opt out without facing devastating consequences for your reputation and prospects. Your career at court would be over. Advantageous marriages would become impossible, and you'd likely find yourself ostracized from the very circles that defined your existence. Historians still argue whether the extreme social pressure to duel was a result of inherent cultural values or a strategic tool used by the elite to maintain their distinct status and enforce conformity within their ranks. Was it a genuine reflection of honor or a mechanism of social control? This intense on social pressure meant that even if a duelist privately harbored doubts about the efficacy of drinking milk or any other pre-duel custom, he would likely still conform. Why? Because these customs were part of the accepted ritual. To deviate might be seen as weakness, as a lack of resolve, or even as an insult to the seriousness of the occasion. It's like showing up to a formal dinner in a tracksuit. It might be comfortable, but it's fundamentally disrespectful to the unspoken rules. In the high-stakes world of dueling, any perceived flaw or lack of commitment could be interpreted as a sign of fear, giving your opponent a psychological edge. Think of the sheer weight of expectation on these men. They were raised in a culture that glorified courage and condemned cowardice. Their entire social fabric reinforced the idea that defending one's honor, even to the death, was the most noble pursuit. This environment fostered a profound conformity to custom, where rituals, however odd, became deeply embedded. The milk wasn't just a personal choice, it was likely part of a shared, unspoken understanding of how one prepared for such an ordeal. Perhaps you saw older, more experienced duelists doing it and simply adopted the practice, believing it to be a necessary part of the pre-fight ritual. So, as our Elizabethan courtier takes that final, perhaps reluctant, sip of milk, his mind is battling not just the fear of his opponent's blade or the dread of poison, but also the immense weight of societal expectation. He is performing a ritual, not just for himself, but for the watching eyes of his seconds, and indeed, for the invisible jury of his peers. The milk, in this context, becomes less about its inherent properties and more about its symbolic role in a complex, deadly performance. It's an act of public conformity, a demonstration that he understands and respects the grim rules of the game. It underscores the profound influence of collective belief in shared ritual, where doing what is expected, however peculiar, is often more important than personal conviction, especially when facing death to uphold your standing. You're still standing there, on that quiet, misty dueling ground, the Elizabethan courtier having perhaps just performed his final, peculiar ritual of drinking milk. We've explored the immense social pressure to conform to these customs, but let's consider a more practical, yet often overlooked, aspect of milk's source farm to flask. In our modern world, milk is a ubiquitous product, readily available in sterile cartons from any grocery store. We rarely give a second thought to its origin or preparation, but in Elizabethan England, things were vastly different. The journey of milk from the udder to a gentleman's goblet was far less straightforward and far more rustic. Imagine a time before refrigeration, before pasteurization, before hygienic milking practices were commonplace. Milk would have been sourced directly from local farms or from the cows kept within larger estates. It was a fresh, raw product, subject to all the natural variations and potential contaminants of the era. The quality would vary wildly depending on the health of the cow, the cleanliness of the milker, and the conditions under which it was stored. A gentlewoman's dairymaid would be responsible for milking, often by hand, and then straining the milk to remove any impurities, though many would remain. Transportation was slow, often reliant on carts or even simple buckets carried by hand. This meant that milk, unless consumed very quickly after milking, would begin to sour, especially in warmer weather. Fresh milk, therefore, was a perishable commodity, a luxury in its own way. If our duelist was at court, the milk might have come from the palace's own dairy or from a nearby supplier, delivered fresh each day. If he was in a more rural setting, perhaps a country estate, it would be even more directly from the farm. Historians still argue whether the perceived purity of milk in Elizabethan times was genuinely valued, or if its common availability simply made it a convenient, if often questionable, liquid for various folk remedies. Was it a symbol of rustic purity, or just a ubiquitous, cheap liquid? Preparing the milk for consumption would also have been different. While some might have drunk it immediately, others might have warmed it slightly, or even added a touch of honey or spices, particularly if it was intended as a soothing or medicinal draught. The act of preparing for the duel might involve not just readying oneself mentally and physically, but also ensuring the availability and proper handling of this particular liquid. You're not just grabbing it from the fridge. You're coordinating with servants, ensuring it's fresh, perhaps even ensuring it hasn't been tampered with, given the pervasive poison paranoia. Remember that web of courtly intrigue? Even your milk could be suspect. This humble origin of milk, from a farm to a gentleman's flask or goblet, adds another layer to our understanding of the ritual. It wasn't some exotic potion. It was a common, everyday item elevated to a symbolic and practical role in a life or death situation. The very ordinariness of it, in contrast to the extraordinary danger of the duel, creates a fascinating juxtaposition. It underscores the practical reality of Elizabethan life, where even the most elevated members of society were still deeply connected to the agricultural rhythms of their world. So, as our Elizabethan courtier takes his final sip, he's not just partaking in a psychological ritual or a desperate antidote attempt. He's consuming a product of his time, a perishable liquid transported and handled in ways that would make a modern food safety inspector faint. It's a testament to the era's ingenuity, its resourcefulness, and its willingness to integrate even the most commonplace elements into the most profound and dangerous moments of life. The journey of that mill, from a mooing cow to a nervous duelist, silently reflects the unique blend of the rustic and the refined, the pragmatic and the superstitious, that defined Elizabethan England. You're still standing there, on the cold, damp dueling ground, the mist swirling around the figures of the combatants and their seconds. Our Elizabethan courtier has perhaps just finished his final draught of milk, that peculiar ritual now ingrained in our understanding. But it wasn't just milk that populated the anxious moments before a duel. Gentlemen often employed a host of other preparations, charms, and amulets, and various personal safeguards, all designed to tip the scales of fortune in their favor. Imagine the psychological landscape of a man about to face potentially fatal combat. He's not just relying on his skill with a blade, he's hoping for luck, for divine intervention, for any subtle edge that might save his life. In an age where superstition was deeply interwoven with daily life, it was entirely common for individuals, even highly educated ones, to believe in the power of good luck charms and protective amulets. These weren't necessarily considered magical objects in a strictly pagan sense, but rather items imbued with symbolic power, believed to offer a degree of protection or to channel positive energy. You might see a duelist wearing a small, intricately carved wooden charm tucked into his doublet, perhaps a religious medal blessed by a priest, or even a piece of felt with a specific prayer sewn into it. Some might have carried a small pouch containing dried herbs believed to ward off evil, or a tiny fragment of a saint's relic, though these were more common among Catholics. The belief was that these objects, by their nature or by the intention of their creator, could offer a shield against ill fortune, a deflection of a fatal blow, or simply a boost to courage. Historians still argue whether the use of such charms was a genuine expression of religious faith or more of a pragmatic hedging of bets in a deeply uncertain world, where one sought every possible advantage, spiritual or otherwise. Was it piety or just plain desperation? These mock other preparations and extended beyond physical objects. There might have been specific prayers whispered silently, certain gestures made before drawing the sword, or even particular steps taken on the way to the dueling ground. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen, That was an external application of protective belief. These charms are more personal, internal reassurances. The very act of engaging in these rituals, however illogical they seem to us, would have provided a powerful psychological comfort, reinforcing the belief that one was doing everything possible to prepare for the ultimate test. It was a way to exert a tiny bit of control in a situation that was largely out of one's hands. Consider the contrast on one hand, the rigorous, almost scientific training with the rapier, the precise footwork, the calculated thrusts. On the other hand, a quiet belief in a small, unseen charm. This blend of rational preparation and superstitious belief is characteristic of the Elizabethan mindset. They were pragmatic, yes, but also deeply spiritual and prone to believing in forces beyond their direct comprehension. The line between what was considered effective and what was simply hopeful was often blurred. So, as our Elizabethan courtier, having perhaps gulped down his milk, then adjusted his grip on his rapier, he might also have made a small, almost imperceptible gesture, or touched a hidden amulet beneath his clothing. These charms and amulets, along with the milk, formed a multi-layered defense system, physical, psychological, and spiritual, against the terrifying reality of the duel. They underscore the sheer human need for solace and a sense of agency when facing the prospect of sudden, violent death. The stage is truly set now, the last preparations made, the final hopes clung to. All that remains is the stark reality of steel against steel. You're holding your breath, a silent witness on that hallowed, yet terrifying, field of honor. The preliminary rituals, from the milk to the hidden charms, are complete. All the unspoken fears and whispered hopes have converged to this single, inevitable moment. The seconds have stepped aside, leaving the two protagonists isolated in their deadly ballet. The air, thick with unspoken challenge and grim resolve, now crackles with imminent action. This is it. The duel commences steel against steel. Imagine the stark tableau. Two men, usually dressed in dark, unrestrictive clothing, facing each other. Their rapiers are drawn, points lowered, blades glinting faintly in the pale, rising sun. Their stances are precise, honed by countless hours of practice in the fencing master's salle. Every muscle is tensed, every sense acutely aware. The only sound for a moment is the whisper of the wind through the tall grass, or perhaps the distant call of a bird. Then, a signal, a quiet nod from a second, or perhaps a formal, almost theatrical bow exchanged between the combatants. And then, without warning, the sudden, terrifying shift. The duel begins. It's not a wild, uncoordinated brawl. This is a highly skilled, dangerous dance. You'd hear the distinctive clash of steel against steel, a high-pitched ring that echoes across the quiet field. The blades would blur, moving with astonishing speed as parries deflect thrusts, and counterattacks seek openings. Footwork is paramount: quick advances, sudden retreats, precise pivots to gain an advantage or avoid a lethal lunge. You'd see the concentration etched on their faces, eyes darting, muscles coiled, every fiber of their being focused on survival. A duel with rapier and dagger, as chosen by our courtiers, was particularly intricate. The rapier would be used for long-range thrusts, probing for weaknesses, while the dagger in the offhand became a vital defensive tool, catching and deflecting the opponent's blade, or even delivering a swift, unexpected riposte at close quarters. It's a dynamic interplay of offense and defense, each man seeking to penetrate the other's guard, to find that one fatal opening. You might hear the sharp gasp of effort, the grunt of a parry, the quick shuffle of feet on the damp earth. This is the war fight for life, raw and immediate. Historians still argue whether the dueling styles of the Elizabethan era were truly efficient killing methods or more of an elaborate, formalized display of skill and courage. Was it about lethality or performance? The intensity is almost unbearable. You, as the observer, would feel your own heart pounding. A moment of hesitation, a slip of the foot, a misjudgment of distance, any of these could be fatal. The blades would flicker like lightning, searching for vulnerable points: the throat, the chest, the belly, the sword arm. Blood might begin to stain the fine linen shirts, a stark splash of red against white. The duel could last mere seconds, ending in a swift, decisive thrust. Or it could drag on for several terrifying minutes, a prolonged test of endurance, skill, and sheer willpower. And through it all, the peculiar ritual of the milk, consumed moments before, seems to fade into the background, almost forgotten amidst the immediate reality of steel against flesh. Yet, for our duelist, the small comfort, the perceived protection it offered, however illusory, might have provided just enough mental fortitude to make that crucial parry, to spot that fleeting opening. The sound of blade on blade fills the air, a grim melody of honor and survival. The silence of the dawn is now shattered by the brutal reality of men fighting to the death. You're still frozen on the dueling ground, the metallic tang of blood now subtly in the air, replacing the fresh scent of the morning. We just witnessed the brutal, elegant dance of steel against steel. The terrifying climax of the duel, but the fight, whether it lasted seconds or minutes, is over. Now, the grim reality sets in. The aftermath, wounds, and consequences. 80. The silence that descends after the final thrust is often more chilling than the clashing blades. One man might be slumped on the ground, a dark stain rapidly spreading across his fine doublet, his rapier fallen from a slackened grip. The other might stand, panting, perhaps bleeding from a superficial wound, or perhaps miraculously untouched, but undoubtedly shaken to his core. The seconds, who had stood by like silent sentinels, now rush forward. Their primary concern is to assess the damage, to confirm whether honor has truly been satisfied, and to attend to the wounded. For the victor, there's often no triumphant cheer, no celebration, just a grim sense of relief, perhaps tinged with shock, and the chilling realization of what he has just done. He might feel faint, his adrenaline fading, leaving him cold and trembling. For the wounded, the pain would be immediate and excruciating. A rapier thrust, though slender, could penetrate deep, causing internal bleeding, piercing organs, or severing arteries. These were not clean, superficial cuts. These were often deep, debilitating punctures. You'd see the hasty tearing of cloth to reveal the wound, the gasps of pain, the hurried actions of the seconds trying to staunch the flow of blood. And then, the surgeons would move in, those figures we discussed earlier, with their rudimentary knowledge and even cruder tools. Imagine the scene: the injured duelist lying on the damp grass, perhaps conscious but fading, as the surgeon prepares his instruments. No anesthetics beyond perhaps a swig of strong ale, probing for a blade fragment, stitching a gaping wound with coarse thread, perhaps even cauterizing a deeper injury with a hot iron. These were brutal necessities. Infection was almost guaranteed, often proving more deadly than the initial wound itself. A simple scratch could turn gangrenous, leading to fever, delirium, and a slow, agonizing death. Historians still argue whether surviving a duel was more a matter of sheer luck and a robust constitution than the actual skill of the attending surgeon. Was it their crude art that saved lives, or merely good fortune? The consequences extended far beyond the immediate physical wounds. If the duelist died, the impact on his family would be catastrophic. His widow might be left destitute, his children fatherless, his reputation, if he was deemed the aggressor, potentially tarnished. If he survived, there were legal ramifications, however often they were overlooked. Dueling was illegal, and while prosecutions were rare for gentlemen who fought fairly, the threat of arrest, fines, or even imprisonment always loomed. There was also the psychological toll, the trauma of having killed a man, the nightmares, the lingering fear of retribution from the deceased family. Even a successful duel, where one emerged relatively unscathed, left lasting marks. Scars were common, permanent reminders of the violent encounter. Reputations, while salvaged in terms of honor, could be forever stained by the act itself, particularly if the duel was seen as unnecessary or overly brutal. You might have to leave court for a time, retreat to your country estate, allowing the scandal to die down. The casual way in which Elizabethan society seemed to accept dueling belies the profound, often tragic, consequences for those directly involved. So, as the surgeon works frantically, or as the seconds lift the fallen man, the quiet desperation that led our courtier to drink that milk now seems a distant memory. The immediate brutal reality of the duel has replaced all other concerns. The consequences, both physical and societal, begin to unfold. A stark reminder that even in a world obsessed with honor, the price could be overwhelmingly high. The blood on the grass, the cries of pain, the heavy silence. These are the true legacies of the field of honor. You're still on that somber field. The aftermath of the duel, a raw, immediate reality. We've just witnessed the grim wounds and consequences for the individuals involved. But the duel was not just a private affair between two gentlemen. It was an act with broader implications, and the Crown certainly had something to say about it. This brings us to the legal ramifications, royal proclamations. While dueling was a pervasive and often accepted custom among the gentry, it was, crucially, illegal. Both the church and the state viewed it as a challenge to their authority. The church condemned it as murder and a mortal sin, arguing that only God had the right to determine life and death. The state, represented by Queen Elizabeth and her Privy Council, saw it as a dangerous breakdown of civil order, a usurpation of royal justice, and a source of unnecessary bloodshed among the very elite who were supposed to uphold the law. Imagine the Queen, a formidable and intelligent ruler, receiving reports of her noblemen killing each other over perceived slights. It disrupted the stability of the court, depleted her pool of trained military officers, and undermined her authority. Consequently, Elizabeth I issued numerous royal proclamations throughout her reign, strictly forbidding dueling. These proclamations threatened severe penalties, including imprisonment, heavy fines, confiscation of property, and even, in extreme cases, execution. You might recall seeing such a proclamation, perhaps nailed to a church door or read aloud by a town crier, a stern warning against the practice. However, the effectiveness of these proclamations was, to put it mildly, inconsistent. While the Queen's intent was clear, the enforcement was often lax, particularly when powerful noblemen were involved. Justices of the peace, often gentry themselves, might be reluctant to prosecute their peers. Public opinion, as we'll discuss next, was also divided, and the social pressure to uphold honor often outweighed the fear of legal repercussions. If you were a prominent figure, a quick trip to the Tower of London might be an inconvenience, but far less damaging to your reputation than being branded a coward. Historians still argue whether these royal proclamations were genuine attempts to suppress dueling or largely symbolic gestures designed to maintain the appearance of law and order without truly challenging aristocratic privilege. Were they a serious effort at reform or political window dressing? Sometimes efforts were made to mediate disputes before they escalated to duels, often by the Privy Council itself. The Queen's trusted advisors might summon the feuding parties, attempting to broker a reconciliation or impose a settlement that satisfied honor without bloodshed. But if these efforts failed, and a duel occurred, the Crown faced a dilemma: how to punish without alienating powerful factions. Often punishment was meted out, but selectively, and with an eye to political expediency rather than strict justice. So, as our duelist, whether victor or survivor, walked away from the field of honor, the shadow of legal ramifications would inevitably follow him. He might need to go into temporary hiding, seek the protection of a powerful patron, or simply hope that the crown would turn a blind eye. The paradox of Elizabethan dueling is striking an illegal act, yet one so deeply woven into the social fabric that it persisted despite official condemnation. The Queen's pronouncements were a constant reminder of the law, but the unwritten code of honor often proved to be the stronger force. And in this precarious dance between law and custom, the peculiar ritual of drinking milk, a small, personal act of preparation, seems almost insignificant against the backdrop of royal authority, yet it highlights the individual's desperate attempt to control what little they could in a world where the rules were constantly shifting, and where your life could be forfeit not just by a blade, but by a legal decree or a social condemnation. The aftermath of a duel, therefore, was never just about the physical recovery. It was about navigating a treacherous legal and social landscape, hoping to emerge with both life and honor intact. You're still on the edge of the dueling ground, the legal implications of the clash still lingering in the air like the scent of gunpowder. We've seen how royal proclamations had tried, often in vain, to curb dueling. But what did the common folk, the merchants, the artisans, and even the lower gentry think of these deadly encounters? This brings us to public opinion, a divided view. Imagine the bustling streets of London, the crowded taverns, the lively markets. News, often by word of mouth, traveled quickly. The latest duel, especially if it involved prominent figures, would be a hot topic of conversation. But unlike today, where we might condemn such violence outright, Elizabethan public opinion was far more nuanced and, indeed, divided. On one hand, there was a segment of society, particularly those who prioritized civic order and religious morality, who viewed dueling as a reckless, irreligious, and utterly wasteful practice. They saw it as an affront to God's law, a barbaric custom that led to unnecessary deaths and orphaned children. Preachers would rail against it from the pulpits, condemning it as an act of pride and a challenge to royal authority. You might hear common citizens grumbling about the arrogance of the gentry, who seemed to shed blood so casually over mere words. For them, it was an act of folly, a demonstration of aristocratic excess. However, on the other hand, there was a strong romanticized view of dueling, particularly among those who admired valor, courage, and the strict adherence to a gentleman's code of honor. Plays and ballads of the era often depicted duelists as heroic figures, men willing to die for their good name, embodying the very ideals of bravery and integrity. For many, a man who successfully defended his honor in a duel was a figure to be admired, a paragon of masculine virtue. It was a spectacle, a drama playing out real-life consequences, and people were fascinated by it. You might overhear spirited debates in a tavern, some condemning the violence, others praising the courage. Historians still argue whether this romanticization of dueling in popular culture merely reflected existing social values or actively contributed to their perpetuation, making the practice even more entrenched. Did art imitate life, or did it shape it? This duality in public opinion created a complex social environment. While the law officially condemned dueling, the unwritten social code, enforced by the admiration and judgment of peers, often gave it a tacit, if unofficial, approval. A gentleman might face legal repercussions, but he might also gain immense social standing and respect for having demonstrated his bravery. This tension between formal law and informal social acceptance made it incredibly difficult to eradicate the practice. So, for our Elizabethan duelist, the aftermath of his encounter wasn't just about his physical recovery or legal standing. It was also about how he would be perceived by the wider world. Would he be seen as a reckless hothead or as a man of unwavering honor? This public judgment, however contradictory, would undoubtedly weigh on his mind. The peculiar ritual of drinking milk, while a private act, was part of this broader public performance of readiness and adherence to custom. It was a detail, perhaps, that contributed to the overall impression of a man who was prepared, in every way, to face his destiny. The divided public opinion meant that a duelist often walked a tightrope, navigating both condemnation and admiration, hoping to emerge with his reputation, as well as his life, intact. The whispers and murmurs of the crowd, both supportive and critical, would follow him long after the sounds of clashing steel had faded. You're still standing there, on the field of honor, the sun now fully risen, chasing away the last vestiges of mist and revealing the stark reality of the duel's outcome. We've explored the complex tapestry of public opinion, revealing how a seemingly barbaric act was simultaneously condemned and celebrated. Now let's reflect on how this unusual custom of drinking milk contributes to our understanding of the entire era. The milk's legacy, a historical puzzle. This peculiar ritual of drinking milk before a duel, while perhaps a small detail in the grand sweep of Elizabethan history, serves as a fascinating microcosm of the entire period. It's a puzzle piece that, when examined closely, reveals so much about the social, medical, psychological, and even superstitious currents flowing through the late 16th century. It's not just about a drink, it's about what that drink represents in the context of life and death. Honor and fear. Think of it, the milk encapsulates the era's rudimentary understanding of the human body and health. In a time when the inner workings of digestion and toxicology were largely unknown, people clung to simple, observable phenomena and ancient wisdom. The belief in milk's stomach-coating abilities, however misguided, tells us about the desperate attempts to make sense of internal processes, especially when facing an invisible threat like poison. It highlights the vast gap between Elizabethan science and our modern understanding. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from way back? This is its internal counterpart, a desperate, pre-scientific attempt at protection. Furthermore, the milk tradition illuminates the pervasive poison paranoia that permeated courtly life. This wasn't just a literary trope. It was a very real anxiety that drove people to extreme lengths. The constant threat of covert assassination meant that any perceived antidote, no matter how simple, gained immense significance. The milk, therefore, stands as a testament to the climate of distrust and intrigue that defined the Queen's court, where even a seemingly innocuous drink could be viewed through the lens of life and death. The custom also speaks volumes about the psychological landscape of the duelist. Facing imminent death, every man, no matter how brave, would seek comfort and confidence. The milk, whether through a placebo effect, a simple calming sensation, or a deeply ingrained superstition, offered a psychological edge. It reminds us that even in an age of strict honor, codes and overt displays of courage, human beings are still vulnerable, seeking solace and ritualistic reassurance in the face of overwhelming fear. Historians still argue whether such peculiar rituals genuinely impacted the outcome of duels by boosting morale, or if their influence was purely symbolic, a reflection of the participants' anxieties rather than a practical aid. Was it a game changer, or just a coping mechanism? Finally, the milk's legacy underscores the powerful grip of social pressure and conformity to custom. Even if individual duelists harbored doubts, the widespread practice meant that to omit it might be seen as weakness or disrespect to the ritual. It was part of the unspoken rules, a detail in the grand performance of honor. This tells us that even when logic might dictate otherwise, societal expectations often held sway, compelling individuals to participate in traditions that define their very place in the world. So, the glass of milk, seemingly insignificant, becomes a profound symbol. It's a key to unlocking a deeper understanding of Elizabethan courage, paranoia, superstition, and the intricate social codes that governed a perilous yet fascinating age. It's a small, peculiar act that opens a window onto a much larger, more complex historical puzzle, reminding us that history is often found in the strangest and most unexpected details. You're still on the quiet dueling ground, the echoes of steel and the lingering scent of damp earth now receding, as we contemplate the layers of meaning behind the Elizabethan duelist's milk. We've seen how this ritual serves as a historical puzzle, revealing so much about the era's unique mindset. Now let's bring our own modern perspective to bear. Modern perspectives debunking myths. From our vantage point in the 21st century, armed with centuries of scientific advancement, the Elizabethan belief in milk as a protective agent against poison or as a significant fortifier before a duel seems, frankly, absurd. We can confidently say that the idea of milk forming an impenetrable stomach lining or acting as a genuine antidote to most poisons is a complete myth. Consider our understanding of toxicology. Most poisons work by being absorbed into the bloodstream, where they can interfere with cellular processes, nerve function, or organ systems, while some very caustic substances might be slightly diluted or temporarily buffered by milk. It offers no real defense against the vast majority of deadly toxins, especially those that act quickly. In fact, when for certain fat-soluble poisons, consuming milk might even hasten absorption. Imagine a modern emergency room doctor being told a patient ingested poison and responded by giving them a glass of milk. They'd be bewildered, to say the least. This fundamental scientific understanding allows us to debunk the primary medical rationale behind the milk ritual. Furthermore, from a nutritional standpoint, while milk is a source of calories and protein, its immediate impact on strength or endurance for a sudden, intense physical exertion like a duel would be minimal. It wouldn't provide the instant burst of energy that a complex carbohydrate might, nor would it magically enhance reflexes or sword-fighting prowess. The perceived physical benefits were far more likely to be psychological, the placebo effect, as we discussed. Historians still argue whether the persistence of such scientifically unfounded practices highlights the limitations of medical knowledge in that era, or if it underscores the human tendency to seek comfort and control through ritual, regardless of logical efficacy. Was it truly a belief in science, however flawed, or a desperate embrace of symbolic power? The absence of modern refrigeration and pasteurization also means that the milk consumed would have been raw and potentially teeming with bacteria. Far from being a source of protection, it could have been a source of illness, adding another layer of risk to an already perilous situation. It's a bit like trying to save yourself from a raging fire by stepping into a leaky rowboat. Only the rowboat might also give you food poisoning. So, while we can appreciate the Elizabethan mindset in the context that gave rise to these beliefs, the fear of poison, the lack of scientific understanding, the powerful pull of superstition, our modern perspectives allow us to clearly identify the ritual of drinking milk as a testament to the scientific limitations of the age, rather than any actual medical efficacy. It's a reminder of how far we've come in understanding the human body and the world around us. This doesn't diminish the historical significance of the custom. Of course, rather, it enhances it. It allows us to view the past not through a romanticized, anachronistic lens, but through a clearer understanding of the challenges and misconceptions faced by people in different eras. The duelist's milk, in this light, becomes less about its supposed power and more about the enduring human desire for reassurance, for an edge, however illusory, when confronting the ultimate uncertainty of life and death. It's a quaint, perhaps even amusing historical tidbit that nevertheless underscores the profound differences between their world and our own. You're still on the quiet dueling ground. The scientific myths about milk now debunked by our modern understanding. Yet, the persistent presence of this peculiar ritual demands further exploration. If not for physical efficacy, then what else did milk represent? This leads us to consider its symbolism, purity, and innocence. So, imagine the stark contrast: a man preparing to engage in an act of premeditated violence, an act that could lead to murder or his own demise, choosing to consume a liquid so universally associated with purity and innocence. Milk, across countless cultures and throughout history, has been seen as a symbol of life, nourishment, and untainted goodness. Think of a baby drinking its mother's milk, or the pristine white of freshly poured dairy. It represents beginnings, sustenance, and unsullied nature. In a world where blood was about to be shed, where honor was defended through brutal force, and where the air was thick with the threat of treachery and poison. The act of drinking milk could have been a powerful symbolic gesture. It might have been an attempt by the duelist to psychologically purify himself before the engagement. Perhaps it was a silent prayer for a clear conscience, a ritualistic washing away of inner turmoil before facing the external battle. It's like a warrior performing a cleansing ritual before battle, but with a surprising domestic twist. Consider the religious undertones we discussed earlier. In some Christian traditions, white can symbolize purity, redemption, and a state of grace. While milk isn't consecrated like sacramental wine, its inherent whiteness and perceived purity could have lent it a spiritual resonance. It might have been an unconscious attempt to connect with something untainted, to appeal to divine mercy, or simply to feel a sense of internal cleanliness before potentially committing a mortal sin. Historians still argue whether the symbolic meanings attributed to everyday substances in historical rituals were consciously understood by participants, or if they were largely unconscious cultural associations that permeated their actions. Was it a deliberate act of symbolism or an intuitive reliance on ingrained cultural beliefs? Furthermore, in a society riddled with courtly conspiracies and poisoned paranoia, where deception and hidden threats lurked around every corner, milk might have represented a craving for something simple, honest, and unadulterated. It was a stark counterpoint to the complexities and dangers of their world. The act of drinking it could have been a subconscious yearning for a return to a state of innocence, a brief mental escape from the grim reality of their situation. So, as our Elizabethan courtier took that final sip of milk, perhaps his mind wasn't solely on physical protection or spiritual absolution. Perhaps, deep down, he was engaging in a profound act of shurum, symbolism. He was imbibing purity before bloodshed, innocence before violence, cleanliness before corruption. It was a silent, personal plea for a moral advantage, a psychological cleansing before descending into the brutal reality of the duel. This interpretation adds a poignant layer to the ritual, transforming a simple drink into a powerful emblem of the human spirit's desire for goodness, even when faced with its darkest impulses. It's a testament to the enduring power of symbolism, allowing humans to imbue the mundane with profound meaning, especially when staring into the abyss. You're still on the quiet dueling ground, the symbolic weight of milk's purity and innocence, lingering in the crisp morning air. We've explored the external pressures and perceived practicalities. Now, let's delve into the internal world of the duelist himself. The courtier's mindset, fatalistic resolve. Imagine being an Elizabethan courtier. You live in a world where disease is rampant, life expectancy is short, and violence, both personal and public, is a constant specter. Death is not a distant, abstract concept. It is an intimate acquaintance, lurking around every corner. For these gentlemen, particularly those engaged in the high-stakes world of court politics and personal honor, the possibility of a sudden, violent end was a daily reality. This constant proximity to mortality fostered a particular psychological stance, a fatalistic resolve. This wasn't necessarily a resigned despair, but rather a stoic acceptance of one's fate. If a duel was challenged and accepted, it was often viewed as inevitable. You had done all you could to prepare, trained, chosen your seconds, perhaps even consumed your milk and touched your charms. The rest was up to destiny, or God, or simply the skill of your opponent. There was a sense that once the wheels were in motion, once honor demanded satisfaction, the outcome was largely predetermined. This mindset allowed them to face incredible danger with a remarkable degree of composure, a grim determination rather than a frantic panic. You might see it in their eyes, a steely glint, not of bravado, but of a deep inner acceptance. This fatalistic resolve was deeply intertwined with the concept of honor itself. To die bravely in defense of one's name was seen as a noble, even glorious end. It was far preferable to living a life of shame and dishonor. So, while the prospect of death was terrifying, The fear of dishonor was often greater, pushing them towards seemingly suicidal acts with a grim determination. Historians still argue whether this fatalism was a genuine philosophical stance or a psychological defense mechanism developed to cope with a brutal and unpredictable reality. Was it true stoicism, or simply a way to manage overwhelming anxiety? The milk, in this context, fits perfectly into this mindset. It wasn't about guaranteeing victory or even survival. It was about performing the expected rituals, about doing everything within one's power, however small or symbolic, to prepare oneself for the inevitable. It was an act of personal readiness, a mental check-off of duties performed before surrendering to fate. The calmness it might have provided was not just physiological. It was the calmness of a man who has made his peace, who has accepted his lot, and is now ready to face whatever comes. You wouldn't have seen these courtiers weeping or cowering, at least not in public. They would have presented a facade of unflappable courage, even if their insides were churning. This was part of the performance, part of upholding the code of a gentleman. The fatalistic resolve was a shield, allowing them to stare death in the face without flinching, to perform their deadly dance with dignity, however grim. So, as our Elizabethan duelist stands poised, rapier in hand, having consumed his peculiar draught, his mind is likely not filled with frantic hope, but with a quiet, fatalistic resolve. He is ready. He has done all that honor demands, all that superstition suggests, and all that his limited medical understanding allows. The milk is just one small piece of that acceptance, a final, almost meditative act before the terrifying immediacy of the duel commences. It underscores the raw courage and terrifying mental fortitude required to live and die by the sword in Elizabethan England. The whisper of destiny is in the air, a silent agreement with the inevitable. You're still fixed on that dueling ground, the duelist imbued with a chilling, fatalistic resolve. We've explored many layers of meaning for the milk, from perceived physical benefits to deep symbolism. But let's consider a simpler, perhaps even slightly whimsical, interpretation for this odd ritual. Fringe theories, a digestible diversion. Sometimes the simplest answers are the hardest to see, especially when we're looking for profound historical significance. What if, for some duelists, the milk wasn't about complex medical theories or deep spiritual symbolism or even intense superstition? What if it was, quite simply, a digestible diversion? Imagine the sheer, gut-wrenching anxiety of standing moments away from a deadly encounter. Your stomach is in knots, your mouth is dry, and every fiber of your being is screaming. In such a state, eating a hearty meal would be out of the question. You'd likely vomit it up or feel too sluggish to fight effectively. But you still need something, anything, to distract your anxious mind, to give your body a small, comforting task. This is where a simple, easily consumed liquid like milk could come in. The act of slowly drinking a glass of milk, however odd, provides a momentary break from the overwhelming mental and emotional pressure. It gives your hands something to do, your throat something to swallow, your mind a small, manageable focus. It's a physical action that can help ground you, even for a few seconds, when your thoughts are racing towards the abyss. Think of it like a fidget spinner for the Elizabethan duelist, but with actual calories. You see a nervous modern person fiddling with their keys or tapping their foot. For the duelist, a sip of milk could serve a similar purpose, a small, controlled action in a situation spiraling out of control. Furthermore, milk is generally easy on the stomach, even an anxious one. Unlike alcohol, which might impair judgment or coordination, milk offers a soothing quality without any debilitating side effects. It's a non-alcoholic, readily available, and comforting liquid. Perhaps some courtiers simply found it the most palatable option when their stomachs were tied in knots, preferring it over water or wine that might feel too harsh. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of consistent, documented reasons for many historical customs suggests a lost cultural context, Or if some practices were simply ad hoc solutions that became tradition through repetition? Was it deeply meaningful, or just what they happened to have on hand? This our fringe theory, Ross, suggests a more human, less grand explanation. It acknowledges the simple, physiological responses to extreme stress. When you're terrified, your body reacts. A little something to swallow, something to moisten the throat, something to gently fill the stomach without causing further upset, could be all that was needed. It's a testament to the practical, sometimes mundane, ways humans cope with extraordinary circumstances. So, as our Elizabethan courtier took that final gulp, perhaps his sophisticated mind wasn't dwelling on ancient herbal lore or spiritual purification. Perhaps in that moment of raw fear, he was simply focused on the sensation of the cool liquid, the momentary act of swallowing, finding in that mundane action a digestible diversion from the terrifying reality that awaited him. It adds a touch of relatable humanity to the often romanticized world of dueling, reminding us that even the most stoic and honorable of men were still, at their core, just people trying to get through a really, really bad day. You're still standing there, on the quiet dueling ground, that small, seemingly mundane act of drinking milk now seen through yet another lens. A simple, digestible diversion from overwhelming stress. But whatever the reason for the milk, the duel itself, and the entire culture of honor that spawned it, came at a staggering cost. Let's reflect on the cost of honor, lives, and fortunes. Imagine the sheer human toll exacted by this pervasive code. Duels, even if not always fatal, frequently resulted in severe injuries. A deep thrust from a rapier could pierce a lung, sever an artery, or cause internal bleeding, leading to agonizing pain, debilitating illness, and often a slow, miserable death from infection. Even if a man survived, he might be left with a permanent limp, a scarred face, or a weakened constitution, impacting his ability to work, to socialize, and to live a full life. These weren't just abstract concepts, they were broken bodies and shattered lives. Beyond the immediate physical cost, there was the immense personal and familial suffering. Every duel meant at least one family, and often two, plunged into grief and uncertainty. If a man died, his wife became a widow, his children became orphans. In an age with limited social safety nets, this could mean financial ruin, destitution, and a dramatic downturn in social standing for the bereaved family. The carefully constructed edifice of their fortune and future could crumble in minutes. Think of the hidden tears, the whispered laments, the lives irrevocably altered by a single, sharp thrust of steel. Historians still argue whether the societal benefits of upholding honor, such as maintaining social order, or deterring perceived insults, truly outweighed the very real human and economic costs of dueling. Was it a necessary evil, or simply an unsustainable indulgence of the elite? And then there was the cost of fortune. Preparing for a duel wasn't cheap. You needed fine, well-maintained rapiers, which were expensive. You might need to pay a fencing master for lessons, and good ones didn't come cheap. If you were wounded, the surgeon's fees, however crude their methods, would add up. And then there was the potential for long periods of convalescence, meaning lost income or opportunities. If you were prosecuted for dueling, fines could be ruinous, and legal fees astronomical. Even avoiding prosecution might involve bribing officials or making large donations to powerful figures. Moreover, the constant pressure to maintain an image of wealth and status, intertwined with honor, meant courtiers often lived beyond their means. Debts piled up, estates were mortgaged. The very pursuit of honor, which was supposed to secure their social standing, could paradoxically lead to their financial ruin. You can almost see the ledger books, stained with ink, revealing the slow, steady drain of resources on lavish clothing, gambling, and inevitably, the cost associated with defending one's name. The cost of honor was not merely theoretical. It was tangible, measurable in lives lost, bodies broken, and fortunes squandered. It was a brutal paradox, a system designed to elevate a gentleman's standing, often led to his ultimate downfall, physically, emotionally, and financially. The peculiar ritual of the milk, so small an act, stands in stark contrast to this overwhelming cost. It was a tiny, hopeful gesture in the face of a system that demanded immense sacrifices, a quiet prelude to the profound, often tragic, consequences that awaited beyond the clash of blades. The silent cries of widows and orphans, the crumbling of ancestral homes. These were the true, untold stories of the dueling era, the grim ledger of lives and fortunes, paid for the sake of a perceived slight. You're still on the quiet dueling ground, the staggering cost of honor, a sobering realization. But even as this brutal reality unfolded in life, it was simultaneously being transformed into art. The duels, the challenges, the very code of honor that governed them, found a powerful and enduring voice in the literature of the age, particularly in the works of one of England's greatest playwrights. This brings us to echoes in literature, immortalized duels. Imagine sitting in a crowded, boisterous Globe theater, the smell of oranges and sweat filling the air. On stage, glittering in their theatrical finery, actors bring to life the very dramas you see played out in the streets and courts. Elizabethan and Jacobean literature, especially its plays, is absolutely replete with scenes of dueling, challenges, and the passionate defense of honor. It was a theme that resonated deeply with audiences, reflecting their own lived experiences and the values they held dear, however contradictory. Think of William Shakespeare, the quintessential chronicler of his age. His plays are filled with swordsmen, hot-headed youths, and fatal encounters stemming from insulted honor. From the iconic duel between Romeo and Tybalt, fueled by family feuds and a sense of injured pride, to Hamlet's final poisoned fencing match. Dueling is woven into the very fabric of his narratives. These aren't just thrilling plot devices. They are incisive commentaries on the social code, the dangers of unchecked passion, and the tragic consequences of adhering to a rigid, often self-destructive sense of honor. You'd hear the audience gasp, murmur, or cheer, recognizing the familiar patterns of challenge and retribution from their own lives. But it wasn't just Shakespeare. Playwrights like Ben Jonson and John Webster also depicted duels, often with a more cynical or critical eye, exposing the folly and absurdity of men dying over trifles. Ballads and popular pamphlets would sensationalize real-life duels, turning prominent figures into legends and their deadly encounters into cautionary tales or heroic sagas. This constant portrayal in popular culture reinforced the image of the duelist as either a tragic figure or a valiant hero, depending on the narrative. Historians still argue whether the dramatization of dueling in literature primarily reflected existing societal norms or actively shaped public perception and even encouraged the practice by making it appear glorious. Did the stage hold a mirror to society, or did it subtly guide its behavior? Crucially, these literary depictions often included the rituals surrounding the duels, perhaps even hinting at the more peculiar preparations. While the pre-duel milk might not have been explicitly mentioned, it perhaps lacked the dramatic flair of a blood oath, the atmosphere of solemnity, the presence of seconds, the discussion of terms. All these elements were immortalized. The literature captured the essence of the moment, the heightened tension, the internal struggles, and the grim inevitability. It provided a framework for audiences to understand and process the phenomenon of dueling, transforming chaotic violence into a structured, if deadly, art form. So, for our Elizabethan courtier, the duel was not just a personal ordeal, it was part of a larger cultural narrative, one that would be recounted, romanticized, and perhaps even criticized in the popular tales and plays of his time. The very act of engaging in a duel, including its most curious rituals like drinking milk, contributed to this rich literary tapestry. These immortalized duels served as both entertainment and social commentary, ensuring that the legacy of this brutal custom and the peculiar habits that accompanied it would echo through the centuries. Long after the actual practice faded, it's a reminder that even the most fleeting human actions can find eternal life in the realm of stories. You're still standing there, contemplating the immortalized duels and serene of Elizabethan literature, their echoes now reaching across centuries. But even as these dramatic encounters found their place in plays and ballads, the real-world practice of dueling began its slow, inexorable decline. This brings us to the fading custom of bygone era. The Elizabethan era, for all its love of spectacle and honor, eventually gave way to new social norms, evolving legal systems, and changing philosophical perspectives. The intense prevalence of dueling, while seemingly intractable during its heyday, could not last forever. Several factors contributed to its gradual, though not immediate, disappearance. Firstly, the Crown's efforts, though inconsistent, eventually began to have more teeth. Successive monarchs, following Elizabeth I, continued to issue stronger condemnations and enacted more rigorous legal punishments. While duels continued to occur, the legal risks became higher, making gentlemen think twice. The social cost of being imprisoned or losing one's lands began to outweigh the perceived benefit of satisfying honor through bloodshed. Slowly, the balance shifted from social imperative to legal deterrent. Secondly, societal attitudes gradually began to change. As the Enlightenment approached, there was a growing emphasis on reason, civic order, and the authority of the state. The idea of private citizens engaging in lethal combat to settle personal grievances began to be viewed less as a noble act and more as a barbaric relic. The very concept of honor itself, while still important, became less tied to physical combat and more to integrity, reputation, and public service. Think of it like a gradual cultural shift, like how people eventually stopped wearing ruffs the size of dinner plates. Things just slowly fall out of fashion. Historians still argue whether the decline of dueling was primarily due to stricter legal enforcement or a fundamental shift in societal values and the understanding of honor. Was it top-down pressure or bottom-up change? Technological advancements also played a subtle role. As firearms became more accurate and readily available, the nature of dueling changed. A pistol duel, while perhaps quicker, lacked the intricate, almost artistic skill and prolonged drama of a sword fight. It became more about luck and less about personal prowess, arguably diminishing the honor associated with the encounter. Who wants to risk their life in a clumsy exchange of musket fire when a rapier duel allowed for a display of true mastery? Finally, the rise of a more formalized and trusted legal system provided alternative avenues for dispute resolution. As courts became more efficient and accessible, gentlemen had more viable options than resorting to the sword. They could pursue legal action for slander, for debt, or for property disputes, slowly eroding the perceived necessity of the duel. The demand for satisfaction could increasingly be met through legal channels rather than bloodshed. So, while dueling wouldn't vanish overnight, it persisted in various forms for centuries, particularly in France and elsewhere in Europe, and even had a brief resurgence in England during certain periods of its golden age. The era of the rapier and dagger as the primary arbiter of honor began to fade by the end of the 17th century. The elaborate rituals, the desperate sips of milk, the solemn declarations, these became relics of a bygone era. The world moved on, evolving past a time when personal grievances could only be washed clean with blood. It's a testament to how profoundly societies can transform, shedding practices that once seemed utterly essential, replacing them with new ways of thinking and behaving. The stage, once set for deadly drama, now slowly empties, leaving only the quiet echoes of a violent past. You're here now, on what feels like the very last breath of that Elizabethan dawn, the echoes of the fading custom of dueling almost gone. We've journeyed through a world obsessed with honor, shadowed by paranoia, and clinging to peculiar rituals. Now, as the final mists clear, let's bring it all together to truly grasp the meaning of that strange, white liquid, unraveling the mystery final thoughts. We began with a simple question. Why did Elizabethan courtiers drink milk before duels? And what we've discovered is that there isn't one singular, definitive answer, but rather a fascinating confluence of factors that intertwine to form a complex historical puzzle. The milk was never a magical elixir, but its significance lay in the layers of belief and desperation it represented for those facing the ultimate test. We've seen how the terrifying reality of horn poison paranoia, fueled by the relentless, courtly conspiracies of the era, made any perceived antidote a desperate necessity. The notion that milk could concoat the stomach was a primitive, yet understandable, attempt to find protection against an insidious, untraceable threat. It was a reflection of the era's rudimentary medical knowledge and its deep reliance on herbal lore, however unscientific. Beyond the physical, the milk offered a profound psychological edge. In moments of extreme fear, the simple act of consuming a familiar, soothing liquid could provide a sense of calm, a digestible diversion from the churning anxiety. It was a silent act of courage, bolstered by a deep-seated superstition's grip on rituals and beliefs. It offered a fleeting moment of control in an uncontrollable situation, a tiny beacon of hope in the face of daunting odds. Then there's the subtle symbolism, purity, and innocence. In a world about to be stained by blood, the pure white of milk offered a stark contrast, perhaps an unconscious plea for cleansing or grace, a silent nod to religious overtones, and the yearning for absolution. And finally, underlying all of these interpretations was the immense social pressure conformity to custom. Even if a duelist doubted its efficacy, the ritual was part of the expected performance, a demonstration of his adherence to the grim code of honor. It was a cultural touchstone, a subtle indicator of a man ready to face his fate, however strange the preparations. So, as we unravel the mystery, we find that the milk before the duel wasn't just one thing. It was all of these things. It was a desperate folk remedy, a psychological crutch, a symbolic gesture, and a mark of social conformity. It encapsulates the fascinating blend of courage and fear, superstition and nascent science that defined Elizabethan England. It reminds us that people in the past, for all their differences, shared the same human anxieties, the same desires for control, and the same resilience in the face of the unknown. The milk is a silent witness to a brutal time, a small one white thread in the rich, dark tapestry of history. It serves as a poignant reminder that even the most peculiar customs can hold profound meaning when viewed through the lens of the human condition. It's a testament to the fact that when facing death, people will grasp at any straw, however thin, if it promises even a whisper of an advantage. And in that desperate hope, however misguided, lies a deeper truth about the choices we make when our lives hang in the balance. The sounds of the field of honor have faded. The clash of steel is gone. The whispers of fear have quieted, and the peculiar custom of milk before a duel has passed into the realm of fascinating historical oddities. But the stories, the echoes of those lives lived and lost, remain. The sounds around you are softening now, aren't they? The gentle hum of a fan, perhaps, or the soft rustle of your blankets. That crisp, cold dawn air of Elizabethan England is fading, replaced by the warmth and comfort of your own bed. The tension of the duel, the weight of honor, the chill of paranoia, let it all drift away, like the last wisps of mist over a quiet field. There are no more rapiers, no more desperate sips of milk, just the steady rhythm of your own breath. You've navigated the treacherous court, witnessed the clashes of steel, and unraveled a strange historical puzzle. Now, you can let your mind unwind, your thoughts slow. The history is tucked away for tonight. All that remains is peace. Sweet dreams.